It is Monday, March 14th, 2016. We're actually on the road right now in Chicago on our way to the Hear the Watchman conference in Dallas. I'm Doug Hagmann. I'm going to be at the helm for this program. I just want to remind everyone that we broadcast live every weeknight. That's Monday through Friday from 7 to 10 p.m. Eastern Time, right here on the Global Star Radio Network, of course, where we simulcast on Blog Talk Radio. You can watch us live as well and by archive on our YouTube channel. Links to each audio and video broadcasting venue can be found at our home base on the Internet at hagmanandhagmann.com. We also have... Don't forget, we've got two different websites, one for the show, which is hagmanandhagmann.com, and one for news and information, which is hagmannreport.com. Folks, bookmark both. Now, I'm Doug Hagmann again at the helm and coming to you in this somewhat odd broadcast, truncated broadcast, shall I say, because of the fact that we are on the road and headed toward the Hear the Watchman conference in Dallas. And then, of course, folks, if you're not familiar with that, hearthewatchman.com. Tickets still available at the door, I believe, at Dallas-Fort Worth, at the Dallas-Fort Worth Hilton Airport Lakes Executive Conference Center. Looking forward to meeting everyone there and looking forward to spending a lot of time with the such great speakers as Pastor David Langford, just a great scriptorian and pastor, and, of course, Coach Dave Daubenmire and Greg Jackson and J.B. Wells and many others. Looking forward to meeting each and every one of you there as well. I just can't wait, of course, to meet everyone and to be able to shake your hand and to meet you face to face. We've developed a friendship, I believe, and a family-like relationship, and I'm just so excited about this. Tonight, again, this is a little bit of a different broadcast. Joe is not here. We are traveling, again, Chicago and then on to Dallas from there. A couple of things, folks, in case you haven't seen, just a couple of announcements. The official release for my book, Stained by Blood, will be at the conference on Friday, March 18th. There I'll be signing books for conference attendees. If you so choose, you can buy a book, and I'd gladly sign it for you or personalize it for you there. And if we run out, of course, we've made provisions for that as well. It's available on Amazon. That's Stained by Blood. And also on our website, the book's website, stainedbyblood.com. It gives you a little bit of the backstory. Also, there was a video that was posted earlier today about the backstory of Stained by Blood. I just want to thank you for your interest in that story, and thanks for everyone. Thank you for your interest and your comments, and I'm just pretty excited, and perhaps more on that later. But folks, in today's world, perception has become reality, hasn't it? Beliefs have become embedded in the average person's perception of the world and events around them. But in reality, not all things are as they appear. And I recall one time, I'm meeting a man in a high-level position in the world of government intelligence. He told me that, folks don't realize this, but there's an entirely different world out there, a world of evil and one of darkness that exists about which the average person knows nothing. That was once my reality. And I'm sure in many cases, perhaps that was once yours. And at times, don't you long to return to that ignorant bliss of that world? But of course, you can't unsee what you've already seen, nor can you unlearn what you have discovered. You just can't do it. You can't go, as they say, you just can't go home again. And in many ways, Stained by Blood, going back to that, my new book, that's my story of how I came to learn that there are forces of darkness that exist just beyond a very thin veil of normalcy, really at the furthest edge of our periphery that separates good and evil. And these forces are real. And the fact that you might not believe them, it doesn't disprove their existence. In fact, I believe that such forces are actually counting on your disbelief so they can continue their deeds unmolested and undetected. Just as forces of evil and darkness exist, so too does a loving God. Now, you have been given your existence from a loving God for a specific reason, a special purpose in life. In this earthly arena of good and evil, I believe that everyone listening to this broadcast, you've got a position to play, a job to do. And it's up to you to find what that purpose is through prayer. And as for me, I personally believe that I was led to be an investigator to ultimately expose the forces of darkness. And in my book, The Release of Stained by Blood, I believe that that's what that's all about. It's an introduction of sorts to my earthly task, a task that I have yet to finish. And it's very personal to me. And you can check out more on the book at stainedbyblood.com, or you can go simply to Amazon. And by the way, I don't recall if I mentioned this or not, in advance of the release, right now it's available on Amazon. I'm going to take it down. It'll be down for probably half a day to a day, and then be back up. So if you go to Amazon looking for it and for some reason can't find it, check back within a day or so, and you'll be able to find it. Now, there's a lot of news out there, a lot of information to cover, and one of the things that I think is of extreme importance is the political arena. Now, we know, of course, folks, that much of this is just merely smoke and mirrors, that frankly, that the power brokers, the powers behind the scenes, the people behind the scenes, the globalists, the people in power, they control pretty much people and everything. And I've been getting a lot of emails saying, well, do you think Donald Trump, the candidate, is for real? Do you think he's for real, or has he broken off of his chain? Is he being controlled, or is he being genuine? And you know what? I don't know the answer to that, except to say I do know that at a certain level there are gatekeepers, and gatekeepers will allow you in or will push you back. And I think we're seeing this unfold today. And think about this, all right? You've got this tremendous organized pushback against Donald Trump. MoveOn.org, as it has been reported today, raising funds from Trump protests. And they're planning on more disruptions of Donald Trump at his live events. Folks, I've got to tell you, I am very concerned about the political landscape here with respect to Donald Trump, the candidate, and whatever may happen in the immediate future. Now, I'm talking about his upcoming events. We saw what happened in Dayton with that protester who got close enough to almost jump on the stage. And it's amazing, of course, the Secret Service intervened very quickly. But take a look at that incident. And just from my research, my investigation, my contacts, there will not only be more of that kind of behavior, but the threats will increase exponentially. So we've got to keep Donald Trump in our prayers, and certainly we've got to keep an eye on the protests and understand this is not some American Spring taking place, or the understanding of an American Spring, what it might be. No, this is planned. This is organized. The template is very familiar. Arab Spring to most, the majority of American. Right. Ask any American just about, or most Americans. Ask them what prompted the Arab Spring, and they'll say, "Well, it It was a series of protests that began in Tunisia. It was unplanned. It was just a spirit, basically, that caught fire and spread throughout the Middle East. No, that's not the case. Arab Spring was in the planning for numerous years prior to its execution. Libya, Benghazi, that was planned. The takedown of Gaddafi was planned, and of course that was all about running guns and running personnel, training ISIS, training terrorists to overthrow Assad in Syria. That's what that was all about. And the attacks at Benghazi were attacks by Russian proxies. You see, it's not in Russia's best interest, nor is it in China's best interest for Bashar al-Assad to be deposed. Not at all. And the pushback on that was, as Russia, Putin had warned Obama, had warned Clinton, and I do believe that the non-existent yet existent email scandal, the emails will bear this out. They were warned, look, don't continue to support the ISIS terrorists. And this includes Republicans. This includes so-called conservatives, people like John McCain, and the Gang of Eight, the 8 members of Congress and who hold power, a special super Congress, if you will. Unconstitutional, super-constitutional. But they all knew about the itinerary, the events that take place in Libya. They were read in on this. And this is why we're never going to see, I don't believe that we're going to see, barring anything unexpected, I don't believe we're going to ever see anything with respect to any type of action against Hillary Diane Rodham Clinton. Why? Because it would expose the knowledge held by the Gang of Eight as well as other Republicans, Democrats, essentially globalists, from John McCain to Barack Hussein Obama, Barry Soetoro. But there's a larger agenda at play here. But I point that out because that is the template that is being used by the globalists here in this country to spark this violence. And at the epicenter of this violence, ladies and gentlemen, is Donald Trump, the outsider. We're watching a theatrical performance play out here. I truly believe we're seeing a theatrical performance play out. Think about this. You've got MoveOn.org conducting fundraising activities from the Chicago protests against Trump that prompted the Republican presidential frontrunner to cancel a rally there Friday. And if you read between the lines, that cancellation was not just because of the protests. I don't believe that for a moment. Protests can be, with the laws that are in place, protests can be handled, and they can be managed, and they could be terminated, basically, by the police, by security, by the Secret Service. There is something much, much deeper to that cancellation. Much more threatening, much more nefarious. But we're going to see more and more of that. And that is the template that we're seeing play out here in the United States against Trump and anyone else not having the consistent or concurrent or and not being on the same page as the globalists are going to be subjected to this kind of censure and censorship. Short of taking someone out completely, well, you censor them. You put up roadblocks so they can't get their message out. We see it happening in the alternative media. We see it happening every day. This is what's at play. So who's behind it? You've got the globalists behind it. You've got George Soros and people like him behind it. And it's funny because people will say, well, everything can be blamed on George Soros, and seems to be. Well, in this case, you've got this incestuous relationship between people like George Soros, the Clintons, Bernie Sanders, yes, in some cases being the bedfellows together, all lining up against Trump and others. But the thing I really want people to understand, it's just not against Trump. It's against what Donald Trump represents, or perhaps more importantly, the perception of what he represents. Now think about that for a moment. It's just not Donald Trump the man. It's Donald Trump, the anti-establishment, anti-Karl Rovian, anti-Republican establishment agenda. That's what's taking place right now. That's what we're seeing take place. Don't underestimate the power, folks, of these globalists. And do not, by any stretch of the imagination, underestimate the power and the volatility being pushed right now against Trump and others. Watch as you know, we heard about this in the Watergate, stemming from Watergate. Follow the money. Well, that's true in just about every investigation. You follow the money, and you can see that MoveOn.org and many of the pro-homosexual, pro-abortionist groups are involved in these protests. Anyone who is pro-family, anti-abortion, or anti-homosexual sodomite marriage, they're teaming up, regardless of how unlikely of bedfellows they might be under ordinary circumstances. But they're ramping up their efforts. They've been doing this for months, and they've been doing it under the surface. Now, Joe was on the Common Sense show yesterday, and he was talking about his findings, the deep research he conducted, and finding the connections, the information that these protests were planned in advance, and following the money and seeing the people who were involved in this, the different organizations, and here we have it. And it was interesting because a week ago, it was on the 6th, I believe, of March, during the airing of the Common Sense show, and when Joe was a guest, he had said, look, this, or perhaps it was the previous week, I'm not sure, but regardless, he said, look, there will be trouble at this rally. There will be protests. In fact, even worse, perhaps. And that's exactly what we saw. Well, we didn't see it because, of course, the event was canceled. But watch for the social networking to expand. All of this be the social networking. The initiatives using social networking. We're going to see this become more and more overt. And I do believe, in advance of the Republican National Convention this summer in Cleveland, we're going to see much more of this. And I'm extremely concerned about the violence, about the rending of our culture, the violence that will pit brother against brother and family member against family member, and the ideological divide within families. It's becoming more and more pronounced, but it's being exploited, and Trump and those people who are anti-Trump, who are really anti-establishment or anti-government establishment, career politicians, those people are the victims of this. In other words, the people who are attempting to retain power in Washington, the pawns of the globalists are fighting for relevancy, to maintain their relevancy, and to maintain their faces behind the power. Because once the faces are gone behind the power, that hide the power, actual power, then everything is exposed. So watch for more of this as this continues. Now, I'm a believer, as listeners know, that we are looking at a number of things take place in this country. And frankly, these are not disparate or disconnected events. Look at what is taking place right now with this alien invasion. It's getting worse, not better. U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement has revealed that 124 illegal immigrant criminals that were released from jail by the Barry Soetoro, Barack Hussein Obama regime since 2010 have been subsequently charged with murder. Did you hear that? 124 illegal immigrant criminals who were released intentionally by Barack Hussein Obama since 2010 have been charged with murder. Now, this comes from a Center for Immigration Studies report based on data from ICE, from Immigration and Customs Enforcement, to the Senate Judiciary Committee. They added that the committee is not releasing the names of the murder suspects. The criminal, the criminal aliens released by ICE in these years, who had already been convicted of thousands of crimes, are responsible for a significant crime spree in American communities, terrorizing American communities, including 124 new homicides. And as you know, folks, I'm no stranger to homicide in my family. But think of that, 124 families, 124 victims at least, and 124 families touched, crushed, shattered by the actions of Barack Hussein Obama / Barry Soetoro. You wanted hope and change? There it is, hope and change. I don't see much hope. I see a lot of change. Now, ICE had been instructed to release criminals multiple times. 75% were released due to court orders or because their countries wouldn't take them back. So what do? We bring them teddy bears and soccer balls. Does that sound familiar? In 2014 alone, ICE released 30,558 criminal aliens who had been convicted, get this, of 92,347 crimes. How many? What do you think the percentage is of those who have been deported? Half of them? How about 3%? The Center for Immigration Studies, Jessica M. Vaughn, reported that 75% were released. Her report said that in 2014, again, ICE released 30,558 criminal aliens who had been convicted of just about 100,000 crimes, and only 3% deported. Thank you, Jessica M. Vaughn, from the Center for Immigration Studies, for those numbers, for that information. And if this doesn't open your eyes to what's taking place, this is a shocking review of Obama's and the establishment's open border immigration policy. Leave the gate open. We're leaving the light on for these people to commit these crimes, this despicable policy. And those people, are those mayors of the sanctuary cities, are you kidding me? Understand what a sanctuary city is. It's a sanction for criminals. You're safe here with us, according to the mayors. See if you live in a sanctuary city and check the stats out, the murder stats out. And if you do live in a sanctuary city, under whose authority is that a sanctuary city? That, of course, would be the rogue leader of your city, of your town, of your community, generally your mayor, county executive, whoever it might be. You know, citing back to the CIS report, in a memo about the subsequent crimes of released illegals to the Judiciary Committee, Chairman Chuck Grassley, the senator on the Senate Judiciary Committee, said, the aliens, now this is in reference to the earlier reference, were charged with a total of 135 homicide-related crimes subsequent to the release of released from ICE custody. As of July 25 of last year, a total of 39 convictions resulted from those homicide-related charges. Of the 121 total illegal aliens in this country, 2 had homicide-related convictions even before they were released from the custody of ICE. Now think about that. Let that sink in. We are opening the doors of our prisons at the behest of the Barack Hussein Obama, Barry Soetoro regime, and getting a nod by the so-called conservative Republican Tea Party people. Who the Tea Party has been infiltrated. CPAC has been infiltrated. Folks, understand that we are a captured operation, but think about that. Think about what's taking place. How can this be? You want to know what Trump is all about? Do you want to know why people are flocking to Trump and saying, yes, I agree? It's because of the policies of not just Obama, not just the progressive Marxist on his side. No. That's a large part of it. But the acquiescence and the facilitation by the Republicans in office, the rhinos, as they're called, or the conservative, the conservatives in name only, small c conservatives, they're gaming you. Hey, the Tea Party, how's that working out for America? CPAC, what a great rah-rah rally. Let's get going, right? Folks, if you're falling for that kind of smoke and mirrors, you got to know you're being gamed. This is absolutely of extreme importance here. The importance cannot be underestimated. But this is all planned out. You are seeing not a series of disparate, easily distinguished events. You can say, okay, none of this is related. No, this is part of a larger act of conspiracy. And at the epicenter, you've got people like Soros, you've got people like Clinton, you got people like Sanders and others, and as well as even some on the Republican side. You even have presidential candidate Kasich saying, hey, illegals are made in the image of the Lord. Look, every human is made in the image of God. We get that. But to use that to appeal to the evangelical Christians or Christians in general, to me, is a travesty. You see what's taking place here? John Kasich. Illegals are made in the image of the Lord. Yes, everyone is. That does not mean when you've got a criminal element that simply because every human being is made in the image of God that they should be treated not equally, but specially. You see, Trump has been increasing his attacks on Kasich on Trump. There's a lot of behind-the-scenes things taking place, of course. And this illegal alien invasion is a big part of it. Trump says, build a wall, send them back. Kasich says, wait a minute, they're made in the image of the Lord, so we have to treat them accordingly. Yes, of course, humanely, but that does not mean we throw open our doors, our borders. So watch the programming, the verbal programming, the verbiage being used by these shills for the Republican establishment. But really, when we talk about Republicans and Democrats, we're talking about a false paradigm. You know that. I know that. The right-left model has long been gone. No, what are we talking about? We're talking about not just a progressive Marxist agenda, although that does conform better toward the globalist agenda? No, we're talking about the globalist agenda that encompasses both political parties, and that's so hard for people to wrap their name around, or wrap their minds around. God bless illegal immigrants. This bizarre radical statement on immigration. Much of this has been flying under the radar. This being reported today by Breitbart. Yeah, God bless illegal aliens. Illegal immigrants are a critical part of our society. John Kasich told the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce last October, for those that are here that have been law-abiding, God bless them, are arguing that all illegals here, the people inside this country illegally, should have a path to legalization. Now, Kasich also says this. Now, think about this statement. I couldn't imagine enforcing our current immigration laws. That's not the kind of values we believe in. All right, what other laws do you want to toss? What other parts of the Constitution do you want to disregard? Now, why would I even cite Kasich here in this? Because isn't he just merely a footnote in this political race? Of course. But what you're seeing is the unveiling of the agenda by the globalists against the people. Border, language, and culture. Three elements that keep a society a society. Keep a country a country. Border, language, and culture. The invasion by these illegal immigrants are rending at all three. We're tearing the fabric of all three in our culture, in our country, in our society. And they're a vast majority, well, not a vast majority, a significant number, most appropriately, are in fact criminals. They're all by definition criminals because they're here illegally. But I'm talking about violent criminals, murderers, as I had referenced earlier. But Kasich, the remarks, historical and current, represent the globalist plans, the plans of the globalists. He even said that allowing immigration officials to do their jobs is not humane. He told CBS last year that he doesn't support deporting the illegal population. I don't think it's right, he said. I don't think it's humane. Now, can you believe this? He compared illegal immigration to cutting in line at a Taylor Swift concert. I don't favor citizenship for illegals because, as I tell my daughters, you don't jump the line to go to a Taylor Swift concert. You just don't do that. Really? What kind of statement is that? And then, of course, the more famous one, the leadoff. America can't deport illegal immigrants because they're made in the image of the Lord. Of course, that was made last June. The Columbus Dispatch reported on a meeting that took place between John Kasich and an illegal immigrant and her son. You know, where after the meeting he said this. Well, that's conflating and mixing two very distinctly different issues. And you know, if he's elected again. Which, look, Kasich promised amnesty, blanket amnesty, within 100 days if elected. Well, he's not going to be elected, but you have to take a look at what that represents. Again, it's not about Kasich, it's about the message. And back to Trump representing the pro-American message, or the pro-conservative message, at least perceptually. Look at what happened at the campaign rally this last week when we had Thomas DiMassimo, 22-year-old guy, told police his actions. He admitted that jumping on the stage, it wasn't spontaneous. It wasn't just no, it was planned. It was planned. Folks, we are in such a very volatile time. Some compare this time to the 1968 conventions, Democratic Convention. in Chicago. I don't see it that way. I see this more of a captured operation, an assault by the very people who we are fighting against. No, I'm not talking about ISIS. I'm talking about the globalists. This is what I see taking place. That's domestically. I would be extremely careful. I would be extremely careful if you go to Trump rallies, and I do. If that's what you want to do, go for it. But I would be very, very watchful of everything around you. I would pay attention to social networking. I would definitely watch what people are saying on Twitter and on Facebook. Look at the vitriol. Assess the vitriol that's present right now, and even by some self-proclaimed Christians. What we're seeing, folks, to me, in my analysis, is something that, well, we're seeing the deconstruction of the America that we once knew. We're seeing the intended deconstruction. Because, Obama believes he's running out of time. Will he stay for a third term? I don't believe that. He doesn't have to. Although if they made it easy for him, I suppose he would. But he doesn't have to. Because the intended objective is for anyone to get in that office, the office of the presidency of the United States, is going to be under control of the globalists. One man, it's going to take more than one man to make a difference. You've got the Congress. You've got the captured operation that is known as the Congress. Then you've got the Supreme Court. Don't forget we lost Scalia. And the people many people today perceive the Supreme Court more than what it is, having more power than what it does. People forget we've got three branches of government. We've got the executive branch, we've got the legislative branch, and then we've got the judiciary. Well, folks, the checks and balances between all three. Understand the checks and balances between all three. And of the three, the judiciary is the least powerful of the three branches, yet has become the most powerful under this and, over the last, we'll say, 4 or 5 decades, beginning with the rulings in the 60s and taking prayers out of the schools and the Roe v. Wade decision, the Obergefell decision. Folks, the Supreme Court decisions are merely opinions and are binding on the arguing parties only. Yet somewhere along the line, we've taken this to mean that it becomes the law of the land. And as I like to point out, many times I've said this, it's not the law of the land. Otherwise, the Dred Scott opinion would still be the law of the land. And if you know anything about history, you know what the Dred Scott opinion means, and that is that blacks are don't count as an entire person. So, but the Supreme Court, when they decide or provide their opinions on cases, it's binding only to the parties in which the parties that go before the Supreme Court. It doesn't become automatically the law of the land. Our perception, our belief that it does, the dumbing down of our educational system, saying that it's now the law of the land, has made it the law of the land. Perception becomes reality. And in this case, perception trumps reality. It's a sad state of affairs that we're seeing take place right now. Let me go back to something that I think is important to mention. I had earlier mentioned about the man Tommy D. Massimo, the guy who charged the stage at the Trump press conference in Dayton, Ohio. Again, the attacker identified as Tommy Massimo. Who is this guy? Well, he's a student at Wright University in Dayton. He's a progressive leftist, a Marxist, who has participated in various protests, including flag burning. By his own admissions, he's self-identified as an activist with Black Lives Matter and various left-wing social justice groups. He's a Bernie Sanders supporter. Now, folks, we've got to validate this, but by all accounts, this appears to be accurate. There was a video that surfaced this past weekend. I'm not sure how many people saw this. Tommy DeMassimo participating in an ISIS propaganda videos. This being part of their anti-U.S. agenda. One of those videos was uploaded in May of 2015. And he was actually, in that video, the principal subject within the video, which begins with him dragging and burning a flag and ultimately talking to a camera operator. And it's interesting because it appears that somebody, presumably Tommy DeMassimo himself, deleted the YouTube account associated with the video to hide the content. Others have captured it, however, and you can search this on the internet and find it for yourself. But I think it's important to bring this out. But many people who are looking at ISIS and many people who are looking at this guy for having ties to ISIS, for example, the Islamic State, I don't think they're looking far enough, deep enough. And this is why when we had Peter Lavenda on and others on, I think it's important for everyone to understand ISIS. What is ISIS? Well, ISIS, the Islamic religion, has been weaponized, of course. It was weaponized by the Nazis. It was weaponized by people like Zygmunt Brzezinski as a tool and asset against the Russians, and the Nazis against the powers, against Europeans. But this particular situation, watch for the assets, the Islamic State, ISIS assets, to be intermingled with the Marxist progressives, communists, basically, and socialists, and the Sanders supporters, who are rabidly anti-American, rabidly anti-capitalist, rabidly anti-conservative, rabidly anti-family, rabidly anti-constitution. You've got Sanders a self-proclaimed socialist, which is merely a stepping stone toward communist, where a position of communism held by, ideologically communism, held by Hillary Diane Rodham Clinton. But when you look at the ties between, we'll say, the protester at the Trump rally with ISIS, look deeper, because behind those ties, it's just not the Muslim component. It's the nexus between, it's the weaponization of these ISIS sympathizers and facilitators tied together directly with the objectives of the globalists. But many bloggers, many people in the alternative media don't go far enough, and I would just urge everyone to go that extra step. Yes, it's an Islamic situation. Yes, there are ties to Islam. We understand that. But go that extra step. Look deeper, because you will find the very people, many times, that are associated with ISIS or any other Muslim terrorist group, behind them, funding them, deeply involved, training them. You will find elements of this criminal globalist cabal. Folks, they've got to take down this country in order to institute their one world government. That's what their objective is to destroy this country. And they're doing it. It's a multifaceted war. We cannot allow ourselves just to look at one aspect. Just for example, we can't afford to focus merely on the illegal aspect. That's one part. That's just merely one part. We can't afford merely to limit our sights to, well, the illegal invasion. That's one part. The the assault on the Second Amendment. That's just another part. The assault on the family by the homosexual community. And understand what I'm saying here. You've got, with respect to the homosexual community, you've got a 3%, and if you're really generous, a 5%, but that's stretching it, a segment of the population that has some sort of mystical power over 95% of the American population. How is that possible? It's only possible when you understand the game plan. But many Christians, in their zeal to show the fact that look, they're giving their Christian-like. For example, the statements made by Kasich, whether it be current or historical, they're being floated out there today. Why? To program us to say, wait, an illegal alien is made in the Lord's image. Of course, in God's image. Of course. The homosexual made in God's image. Of course. However, their behavior is not sanctioned of God, by the Bible, by the Holy Bible. So it's a play on words. It's a deliberate method to reprogram your thinking. Understand what you are being subjected to. Folks, you've got to understand what's taking place. And you'll find this on CNN. You'll find this on MSNBC especially. We know that. But look at Fox News. Look at the so-called media outlets. Everywhere. It's the same verbiage. The same words. The same process or processes. The same template. Understand the game plan. And when Christians say, well, you don't need to understand, you just need to believe. No, you need to do both. Because understanding what's at play here, ladies and gentlemen, will provide you with an extra layer of protection in your walk as a Christian. Because you don't want to be led into the lion's den unawares, do you? For us not to pay attention as Christians is, to me, not just lazy, although it's all of that, not just an excuse, but it's that. It's not godlike to me. I mean, you've got to understand the wiles of the wicked, expose the darkness, gird yourself up with the protection of God, but also you've got to understand what's at play. You've got to understand their game plan. Become knowledgeable. Knowledge will provide you with the ability to protect yourself and your family and your community, your neighbors. Don't be so selfish to say, I'm just going to lock myself in a prayer closet. Because we can do more than one thing at one time. Can't we? Not only can we should. Folks, one more thing, too, that I'd urge everyone to watch is this. Everyone sees that Donald Trump appears to be the front runner. Going back to the theater of politics, listening to the big talkers, the Rush Limbaughs and the Hannitys and the Mark Levins and everyone else. Everyone says, hey, Trump's a lock, basically, based on the polls and such. Well, watch very carefully what happens between the delegates, assigning delegates, super delegates, winner-take-all states. Watch the machinations of the establishment Republicans, the people like Karl Rove and the head of the RNC, or the head of the Republican National, the RNC, Reese, whatever his name is. Watch what they're doing, because I do believe you are going to see some very nasty things happen and some very underhanded things happen between now and the convention in Cleveland and at the convention in Cleveland, Ohio. You're going to see, I do believe, this ripping, this complete tearing asunder of what has been known as the Republican Party. Why? Why would Republicans, for example, destroy their own party? Here is the reason. Their allegiance is not to their political persuasion, and you're not going to hear any of the big talkers talk about this. Their allegiance is not to the Republican Party or whatever it might have once stood for. Their allegiance is not to the Tea Party or whatever once that uncompromised idea might have once stood for. Their allegiance is to the globalist agenda, of which some of the big talkers are a part of. So, folks, you're not going to hear the big talkers talk about this. You're not going to hear this on the radio. You're going to see, the questions will be, well, they're doing it to themselves, and it's unfortunate, and they're not realizing what they're doing, or what their actions are representing this unintended, or the results, or the unintended consequences of their actions. No, this is very intended. Why? Why is this intended? Because they need to destroy the Christian conservatives, the social conservatives, the ideological conservatives, the people who represent the Constitution, who are the Bible-believing, gun-holding, pro-Second Amendment, anti-abortion, pro-life, anti-sodomite, pro-family people. They need to marginalize that element of that party. So to do so, they burn the entire house down. It would be like somebody not liking the interior furnishings of the house, or the way that the theme of the furniture and the design is going inside the house. So to change it, they burn it all down and reconstruct it in the image that's necessary to be subjugated to a global type of an agenda. This is what we're seeing today. Ladies and gentlemen, we're seeing this happen right before our very eyes, and I've got to tell you, I believe this to be a sign that America, well, now Paul McGuire says, we're on the verge and we are on the cusp, and there could be a great revival, but see, revival is not going to come by any or through any political means. No, revival is only, and Savior is only going to come from a change in our spirituality and our morality and our ideology, and our willingness to stand up and say no. Our willingness to stand up and say, this is not right, this is right, this is what we as a people are all about. But we are not, in many cases, most cases. It's not being taught or talked about behind the pulpit. It's not being talked about anywhere, especially in conservative, so-called conservative places. You only have the illusion of the conservatives. It's an illusion. It's a parlor trick, folks. That's what we're seeing take place. So you're not going to find the big talkers talking about this. Why? Because at the end of the day, this is a captured operation. We are fighting to get out. We are fighting to break down the gates. Others are fighting to come in. The bottom line, folks, is it's got to be a spiritual change, a change from within. Folks, going to be right back. You're listening to the Hagmann and Hagmann Report. Stay with us on this special edition. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to hour number 2 of this Hagmann and Hagmann Report. It is Monday, March 14th, 2016. I'm losing my voice, for which I apologize. What we're going to do, because of the subject matter, because of how important the backdrop of the Nazi ideology is to what we're seeing in America and all across the world, the ideology of the globalists, what I'm going to do, because of my voice and because the fact that we're on the road, is we're going to insert portions of the interview that we did with Peter Levenda from last week. Folks, if you didn't get a chance to hear it, listen to it. It's incredibly important. The playbook is being revealed right before our very eyes. Folks, the Nazi ideology behind the globalist agenda is at play right now. We have to understand what we're seeing, what is taking place. It is so critically important. We are watching the political theatrics play out, but behind the theatrics is not just Republican versus Democrat. Behind the theatrics is is the globalist agenda that's based on a Nazi ideology. Let's call it the Nazification of the globalist agenda. This is what we're seeing. So we are going to play right now the interview we had with Peter Levenda, peterlevenda.com. It was an incredibly informative interview, folks, if you didn't have a chance to listen to it. An absolutely incredibly informative interview. Peter Levenda, author of well over a dozen books, The Hitler Legacy, Ratlines, the Hitler Legacy, Ratlines, and several others. Sinister Forces, a trilogy. Folks, take a listen. Stay with us. Check this out. Welcome, Peter Levenda. Thanks for joining us tonight.
Thank you for having me. Very pleased to be.
Well, I'll tell you what, man. And folks watching live on YouTube, now we don't have live video, but there he is there. That's where our guest, that's what our guest looks like, and that's a picture of him there. And of course, his books. Mr. Levenda, we were talking at the break. I just got to ask you this. We're seeing the world basically embroiled in a global jihad. And I've talked about this, and I've cited your books before. Well, let's start here, and then we can move around which way we want to go. But how did we get here? You wrote about this. You wrote about the weaponization of Islam back in the early 20th century. You wrote about how Islam was used as a political tool, right? A tool of war. And maybe let's start there. Can we do that?
Sure.
All right.
I mean, this is a subject that I think more people should become aware of, because it helps put everything into a certain context. Because right now we don't have context. We just know there's all kinds of strange stuff coming at us from all over the place, and we don't know how it started or why, or if there's an intelligence behind it that's controlling this and creating this world instability that we're all so terrified of all the time. This really began, as you mentioned, towards the beginning of the 20th century. If we look at the state of Islam back around 1910 or so, if we look at the Middle East as an example of this, because Islam is spread all over the world, I've spent a lot of time living in Muslim countries. I've lived in Malaysia and Indonesia. I've traveled a lot through other places. I've been to mosques all over the world. And one thing always is reinforced when I start to do a little bit of research, a little bit of digging, and that is that until World War I, the Middle East was fractured. I mean, it was broken into all sorts of pieces. The British had Egypt for the most part. The Italians had Libya. The French had parts of Lebanon and Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria. The foreign powers had pretty much controlled all of the Middle East. They controlled the canal, the Suez Canal. They were in control of the oil fields and all of this. And they kept the different tribes. And at that point, we're talking basically tribes in that part of the world, except in the cities. They kept the tribes separated at each other's throats. And that wasn't hard to do because they were at each other's throats. There's bad blood between a lot of the groups in the Middle East that goes back for hundreds of years. There's all sorts of antagonisms that they have, hostilities toward each other. There was never anything like a united Islamic caliphate after about the 12th or 13th century, when everything started to fall apart. And the Ottoman Empire came in, basically took over what they could, became the sort of flag bearer of Islam, the religion, as well as, Middle Eastern politics. So everything was coming out of Constantinople, Istanbul. And the Ottoman Empire was also fractured. It was in danger of falling apart anyway. And suddenly you have the Guns of August, and you have the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand. In the Balkans, you have this breakdown of the European hegemony. Everybody's fighting everybody else. So you have the British and the French and the Russians basically united against the Germans and the Italians, and to a certain extent the Turks. Because what the Germans did, they went to Turkey, they went to the head of the Ottoman Empire and said, help us in our fight against the British and the French and the Russians, and we will support you and we will restore your empire that's been decimated by these other powers. What happens next is critical. Politics is politics. Real politics is real politics. People make alliances all the time. They form, they reform. Nobody really honors these alliances for any great period of time. But there was an archaeologist, or a self-proclaimed archaeologist, an amateur archaeologist by the name of Max von Oppenheim. And he considered himself to be an expert on Middle Eastern affairs. He lived in Cairo, near Al-Azhar University, the famous Cairo University. He basically had a kind of harem there as well. He wore a fez and a tarbouch, and he walked around as if he was a real Arab, which of course he was not. In fact, he's from the Oppenheim family. He was, I think, half Jewish. And he becomes the advisor to the Kaiser of Germany at this critical point when World War I is about to start. And he goes to the Kaiser and he says, look, I'm the expert on Middle Eastern affairs. I know how to get the entire Middle East behind you. We can get the oil. We can close the Suez Canal. We can do all these great things, destroy the stranglehold the French and the British and the Russians have. If we can go and convince the Ottoman Empire, to convince the Caliph and the Wazir, the advisor, to declare the first ever in the world global jihad. And this will be a jihad that would enlist all Muslims everywhere in the world against the infidels. Against, in this case, very specifically, the English, the French, and the Russian infidels. Not the German infidels, thank you very much, but the other infidels. And the purpose behind a global jihad was the fact that the European countries had colonies all over the world. And they had colonies in Southeast Asia. They had Malaysia. They had Indonesia. The Dutch had Indonesia at this time. The British had Malaysia. So these are people who are going to be the enemies in World War I. And what they wanted to do was get the Muslims to rise up everywhere in the world and break the stranglehold of the colonial powers. So the emperor in Istanbul thought, well, this sounds like a good idea. So he goes and he has his religious leader. Remember, this is the religious leader of all Muslims, I mean, at least in an honorary capacity, because there is only one caliphate at this point, and that's in Turkey. And they issued the fatwa declaring a global jihad against the Western powers, against the Allies. Wow. Okay, so this goes out to everyone. Okay, all Muslims everywhere in the world, wherever you're doing, drop everything. We're going to fight all these evil infidels, all these non-believers. Didn't quite work out that way because it sounded good on paper. But when you got down on the street level, when you got down to the ground level where the tribes are fighting each other and bickering, they're not paying any attention to what's coming out of Turkey. In the first place, they hate the Turks. In the second place, they're so divided themselves, they have hostilities going back hundreds of years, pretty much like the Balkans. So you had complete Balkanization of the Middle East, people who hated each other. You had different religious sects and denominations. You had the Sunnis and you had the Shia, but you had even more fracturizing. Fracturizing? Is that a word?
Yeah, that works for me.
Okay. And, well, you know what I'm saying. So they were breaking apart even underneath those basic Sunni Shia things that we all know about today, but there were many, many more differences of opinion. You had the Wahhabis, you had the Salafis, you had these extremist Muslims in one part of the world. You had people who were much more moderate than the other. Then you had the Baathists, in Iraq. You had all these people. Well, the Baathists hadn't started yet, but they're going to come out of this period. So everybody's hating everybody else. So the Germans thought they had a lock on the Middle East, and they didn't. You had if anyone has ever seen the movie Lawrence of Arabia, you'll know what I'm talking about. It's pretty good on some of the details. I recommend going back and seeing it if you haven't seen it, because a lot of the names that come up are, real names in history, and it shows you what was going on politically. So it's useful for that reason. You have the British and the French, and they're making quiet deals with Arab leaders on the side. And they're making a deal, of course, with the Zionist organizations out of Switzerland, promising them a homeland in the Middle East. At the same time, they're promising Prince Faisal and King Abdullah. They're saying all these different stories. They're giving them all these other things they're going to do for them. Support us and we'll do this. You'll get your country back. You'll get Arabia back, and you'll have Jerusalem and you'll have Damascus. They're making all these promises that they are never going to keep. Nobody knows this yet, because the British and the French decide we're going to divide up the spoils after the war is over. So you have the famous figure of Lawrence of Arabia, right? And he's uniting the Arab tribes to get rid of the Turks and all this stuff. And it happens. It works. Allenby goes into Damascus, goes into Jerusalem and Damascus. Everything is taken over. The Arabs win their revolt. They're very happy. And Faisal, played by Alec Guinness in the film, is suddenly told, actually, it's not going to go quite the way that we promised you. We're going to do this. We're going to do that. And suddenly Faisal is sitting there thinking, well, at least I have Arabia, right? And they're telling Faisal, not exactly. Now, you have to realize that Faisal was a Hashemite. Faisal's family was in charge of Mecca and Medina, the holy places. Going back hundreds of years, they had the authority there. This is a revered descendants of the Prophet Muhammad. And suddenly they're being told by the British that you're not going to have Arabia. We cut a deal with this other guy. And this other guy was King Saud. And King Saud was a Wahhabi, was a religious fanatic, was a fundamentalist Muslim. But because they cut a better deal with him than they could cut with Faisal, they put him in charge of Arabia. Arabia was never called Saudi Arabia until after World War I, because King Saud named it after himself.
Right. But people
Prince Faisal now winds up. People don't know this.
No, and folks, did you just please listen? Please, ladies and gentlemen, listen, because important foundational information. If you want to know why where we're at, listen to Peter Levenda, our very special guest, Peter Levenda, peterlevenda.com. That's linked off of Hagmann, hagmann.com. Prince Faisal said to Maxwell and Oppenheim, 1915, I thank God that the interests of Islam are entirely identical with those of Germany, just as an FYI. But okay, you point that in your book on chapter 2. But anyway, go ahead, sir. Didn't mean to interrupt.
So they're cutting deals left and right, and the whole focus of this is, well, we want the Suez Canal, we want the oil. So King Saud was a better bet as far as the British were concerned. There's a lot more internecine struggles that went on behind the scenes there. It's very Byzantine, but in the end, Saud wins this contract, basically. He gets the contract, he gets Arabia for himself, names it after himself. And the reason why you have such a strict regime now in Arabia is because Saud was a Wahhabi, and his family are Wahhabis. And Wahhabism is a very fundamentalist strain of Islam. It is not a moderate strain by any means. And in fact, since I have lived in Muslim countries abroad, so I've interacted with Muslims constantly, their feeling towards Saud and towards the Wahhabis is one of distaste. They really don't like these people. They don't like the Saudis. They don't like what comes out of Saudi Arabia. They call it petro-Islam. You have the Saudis setting up mosques every place all over the world, spending huge amounts of oil money to do this, and promoting their own brand of Islam, which is Wahhabism. And that does not play very well in Indonesia and Malaysia and other parts of Southeast Asia where you have strong Muslim influence. They don't like this. They reject it. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. So the dust settles. World War I is over. Faisal is sent off to Damascus. He tries to raise a revolt of his own. He gets destroyed. He gets kicked out. They push him over to Iraq, and they make him the leader of Iraq. So Faisal, who has nothing to do with Iraq, winds up running Iraq. So that didn't last very long either, obviously. While all this is going on, there was no such country as Iraq or Kuwait or Saudi Arabia, as we know. All of these countries were created after World War I. And they were created by the British, who basically took this large map of the Middle East and a ruler and a pencil and decided they would draw the boundaries. I'm not making this up. You had Lawrence, T.E. Lawrence, Lawrence of Arabia, and a woman, Gertrude Bell, famous archaeologist, famous adventurer, one of the few Western women who was actually revered by the Arab peoples because of her knowledge and her bravery and all the rest of that. She set up the Baghdad Museum. She did all sorts of, positive things in that part of the world. But between Gertrude and T.E. Lawrence, they get together and they decide they're going to create the map of the new Middle East. Iraq is created. Kuwait is created. Jordan, Lebanon, all these countries, Saudi Arabia. Everything is created with new boundaries that they decided upon, basically in a back room. And the map that we're dealing with today is the result of this very misguided approach, which Lawrence later regretted and wrote that he regretted it and said we screwed up in the Middle East really badly, especially where the Kurds were concerned. So lines got drawn through all the sort of tribal areas. The French had their section, the British had their section, and of course the State of Israel was being created as well in the middle of all of this. Okay, so we fast forward a little bit into the 1920s, and you have Arabs living in what was then Palestine and North Africa, throughout North Africa and the Middle East. And the British and the French have betrayed promises to the Arab revolt. And they've decided they're going to create a Jewish homeland in the Middle East, in Palestine, and it's going to be with Jerusalem and all the rest of it in this very central area. So the feeling among the people at that time living in the Middle East, among the Palestinians, was, wow, this is really true. This is happening. The protocols of the learned elders of Zion is true. There's Europeans and there's Jewish bankers and there's all these people conspiring to destroy us, right? Mm-hmm. It's as if these predictions are now coming true. We know the protocols of the elders of Zion was a hoax document produced by Russian Secret Service in an attempt to invalidate the Jewish movements that were taking place there, which were, they were flirting with communism, with socialism, with all of this. Karl Marx was Jewish, et cetera, et cetera. So in order to sort of destroy their credibility, they create this hoax document called the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion, which is supposed to be a meeting of a bunch of rabbis in a cemetery, and they decide how they're going to carve up the world. Well, this thing gets promoted in the Middle East as a genuine document, and it is today, still today, regardless of what scholars and academics say. They consider this document to be real, and why? They just point to the situation. Well, look what happened, right? You have this growing resentment now, and it's starting to boil over. The Europeans have betrayed us, and they're associating it with the Jews now, too. So this whole thing is starting to explode. And you have, in the midst of this chaos, a man called al-Husseini arrives. Al-Husseini is very well-connected Palestinian. He has himself declared the Grand Mufti, which is the highest religious leader in Palestine. He's the Grand Mufti. Therefore, his word is golden. He didn't really deserve this degree because he never really got a religious degree. But he, through machinations, typical sort of Byzantine stuff, he winds up he's the Grand Mufti, and he basically declares war against the European powers and war against the Jewish settlers who are coming in, and the whole thing starts to explode. You have riots all over Palestine, and as this is going on, Adolf Hitler is coming to power in Nazi Germany. So by 1933, Hitler is in power. And in 1933-34, the Middle East is in a shambles, particularly the Palestinian area. There are bombings, there are assassinations, there are riots on a constant basis throughout the area. So everything is going really, really badly. And al-Husseini looks at Hitler as sort of the savior of the situation, just as the Turks did with Germany in World War I. Now al-Husseini is looking at Hitler and the Nazi Party in general, the Nazi ideology, as something he can work with because they're as anti-Semitic as he is. Hitler is a strong man, which everybody, in that part of the world reveres, the idea of the strong macho guy who's going to solve everyone's problems. He just sort of falls into place. I mean, al-Husseini thinks this is the greatest thing. So he then starts writing letters and making contact with Hitler. And a young Adolf Eichmann, then one of his first jobs for the SS is that he goes into the Middle East to meet with the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt to meet with al-Husseini, to meet with the anti-European movements, the anti-English movements there, which are all now becoming religious movements, because the story of Wahhabism and the story of Salafism is that Islam lost its dominance in the world because they lost their spirit, they lost their morals, they became degenerated, they became materialistic, so they lost their principles. And now the only way for Islam to be strong again is to go back to the old ways, the old principles, renew their faith, renew their opposition to the infidels and all the rest of it. That's sort of one of the major themes. The West is decadent, and all these ideas you have are decadent ideas. We have to go back to the way it was in the time of the Prophet. So you have a religious and a political thing starting to mix together. And in the middle of this mix, you have Eichmann bringing back news to Heinrich Himmler, saying we have to work with these people. Himmler likes the idea, and he introduces al-Husseini to Hitler. There's photographs of this. It's a very famous series of meetings. And Hitler realizes, as much as he doesn't like Arabs in general, he thinks they're subhuman, he knows he can work with these guys. And he puts al-Husseini into a villa in Berlin, and al-Husseini starts making radio broadcasts to the Middle East, to the Palestinians, telling them to rise up against the British and against the Allied powers in general. Once again, going back to the same World War I scenario, except that al-Husseini is one of them. He's a revered leader in Palestine. They look up to him. They respect this guy. And so he spends the war years in Berlin making these broadcasts, asking again for a global jihad. The Nazis understood we have to weaponize this religion because we can turn it into a tool against the other powers, the British against, once again, the British and the French and the Russians, the same old enemies. But now you throw the Americans into the mix as well. Well, what happens? Hitler loses the war. But the Nazi party machine does not feel they've actually totally lost anything, particularly not the SS. As far as they're concerned, this struggle will go on as long as it takes. And just because they've lost the war doesn't mean that the fight is over. The Nazis, especially the diehard, the really ideologues in the SS in particular, they can work with the Arabs, especially those who are fighting against Israel. They can understand we have a common enemy, and what we can do is work together to overthrow Israel and to cause the Russians and the Americans to fight each other. This was a major platform, you might say, of the SS after World War II. So a lot of war criminals wound up in the Middle East. We all know about Argentina. We all know about South America. What we don't realize is how many actually wound up in Egypt and in other parts of the Middle East. Nazi scientists wound up in Egypt developing weapons of mass destruction to use against Israel. You had Nazi commandos and terrorism experts in the sense of creating terror, training Palestinian commandos to go back into Israel and to blow things up. Otto Skorzeny, very famous guy, Hitler's favorite commando, huge guy, very tall, very big, never say die kind of guy with a tremendous amount of spirit. He manages to escape custody at the end of the war, and he winds up in Spain for a while, Franco's Spain. Franco protected a lot of Nazis before, during, and after the war. And then Skorzeny starts finding himself in Cairo, setting up commando training schools for Palestinians to go and attack Israel. Once again, it's not just a question of guns. It's not just a question of commando tactics. It's also ideology and training. It's anti-Semitism turned into a pure science, a pure political science in a sense. So you have the Palestinians who feel that they can work with the Nazis because of their shared distaste for Israel. To the Nazis, it's pure anti-Semitism. To the Palestinians, for some it's anti-Semitism, for some it's just anti-Zionism, or they just want the Jews out of their homeland. No matter what their religion is, they don't want the Europeans there. It doesn't matter. The Nazis know how to manipulate all sides of this equation.
Right.
So you have very many famous Nazis setting up shop in Cairo and converting to Islam, by the way. Suddenly they all have Muslim names, which helps cement their relationship to this new terrorist work that they're creating. And they're creating it worldwide, not just in Cairo against the Jews, but they're creating it all over North Africa, all over Africa, all over South America, all over Asia. They are creating a kind of Fourth Reich and they're doing it with the expertise that they gained fighting in World War II.
Isn't that amazing? I mean, folks, you talk about the relevance behind what we're seeing now, the history that is so clear to me anyway now, that, you know, I mean, we often say there's nothing new under the sun, the same tactics, but hopefully, I mean, you can see, folks, you can see the groundwork that has been laid to where we're at today. I just found the spread of the Nazi ideology and the conjoining between Islam and the Nazi ideology. I thought that was amazing. And in your book I did not know, for example, that the SS, or I believe it was the SS, or correct me if I'm wrong, the Nazis had platoons or brigades or whatever you want to call those of Muslims, and they were pretty feared.
Sure, there was the Waffen SS, the Bosnian Mountain Division, Anshar Division.
Right.
These were Muslims who were working for the Nazis, and being blessed by al-Husseini, the guy from Palestine, the same guy. There's photographs of him blessing the troops. These were Muslim Waffen SS divisions who were out there in the field fighting in the Balkans.
All right. And folks, we're talking with Mr. Peter Levenda. I should call him Professor Levenda, really. PeterLevenda.com. That's Levenda, PeterLevenda.com. It's right off of Hagmann and Hagmann.com. He's been so gracious to be with us tonight, laying the foundations for where we are today, the global jihad that we're seeing, and of course what others talk about in terms of the Nazification. Maybe that's not the right word, but how the Nazis have advanced in the political environment that we see today, and how they kind of survived. And as you're talking about the Nazis going to various countries, including Egypt and others, the rat lines. I mean, the support that they had after 1945 was just amazing. Well, during the war and after the war was amazing. But before we get into that, I got to ask you this, okay? Have you seen and pardon me if we're skipping around too much, but have you seen the recent History Channel documentaries on Hitler with Bob Baer from the CIA and another couple of guys going out looking for Hitler in Casino in Colombia? I think it's Casino, Colombia area. Are you familiar with that?
I'm familiar with it. I haven't watched all the episodes, but since I did a lot of work in that area myself, I kind of would check it out once in a while and see where they're going. But yeah, they were down in Argentina, I believe.
For Argentina, yeah. Sorry. Okay. Yeah, and you as far as I'm concerned, you had really long before they had ever showed up on the scene, you had really investigated the heck out of this, and I thought it was just amazing. And we're seeing more and more information about Hitler come out, and of course after the wall came down, and obviously Hitler didn't die in 1945 outside the bunker, or at least there's no. Let me rephrase that. As an investigator, I should know better. There's no evidence to support the death of Adolf Hitler in or outside of the bunker, pursuant to the claims of the Russians or anyone else, or pursuant to any claims, right? Right. So the Hitler legacy, which kind of dovetails with what we're talking about. I followed your investigation, and I'm fascinated by it, about what you think or where your trails led with respect to Hitler, because I think, man, you got to be right. You want to? Is this a good time to talk about it, or do we need to talk about something else? Okay, go ahead.
We can connect this because it's all part of a piece of this whole thing. One of the reasons we have to learn what we learned during Watergate, which was follow the money, right? Yep. That famous phrase. At the end of World War II, when the Nazis are dispersing throughout the world, one problem that the Allies had was in trying to locate the gold and all the rest of the stuff the Nazis had stolen. They had been shipping this stuff out of the country, out of Europe even, as early as 1944, when the handwriting was on the wall, and they knew everything was falling apart. Remember, D-Day was in June. In July of 44, there was the assassination attempt on Adolf Hitler, which almost succeeded. From July 44 until the end of the war, Hitler did not make any public appearances. You just didn't see him. For the most part, he was hiding. He eventually wound up in Berlin at the Berlin bunker, and was hiding down there. During this time, the SS was making all sorts of arrangements to get their ill-gotten gains away from the Allies as much as possible. A lot of this gold wound up in Swiss bank accounts, where it was really safe. No, the Swiss were not cooperating with the Allies, no matter how many times you might hear it differently. The Swiss simply did not cooperate with the Allies in this case. And a lot of the gold that wound up in the Swiss banks wound up financing global jihad, wound up financing the Palestinian liberation movements in Palestine, as well as liberation movements in Algeria against the French, on and on. So this money was around. It was being sent by submarine in some cases. We know that 40 tons, we know, I mean, it's a documented thing, it's not speculation, 40 tons of Nazi gold wound up leaving Portugal, from the Bank of Portugal, where it had been stored, and wound up sailing to Macau. Macau, of course, at that time was a Portuguese colony in China. 20 tons of that gold wound up in China. We don't know what happened to it. Another 20 tons of gold wound up in Indonesia. When we talk about the Nazis and we talk about Hitler and we talk about global jihad and all the rest of it, quite often people forget or ignore or are not aware of the role Indonesia plays in all of this. Indonesia is the world's largest, most populous Muslim country. And the population in Indonesia is equivalent to adding together Egypt, Iraq, Iran, and most of the Middle East all together. We're talking about over 250 million people living in Indonesia. When I was searching the Adolf Hitler story, and it came to me by accident, I was in Indonesia. I was actually studying at Gajah Mada University in Yogyakarta, which is their version of Harvard, and I was taking courses there to get my MA degree, and I heard these stories. People were telling me, oh, did you hear about Hitler escaping to Indonesia? I thought that was pretty funny. This was around 2007 or so when I'm starting to hear the story. And I'm saying, well, no, Hitler died in the bunker in April of 45. I know, I wrote about it in Unholy Alliance. I mean, there's no question in my mind that Hitler died in the bunker, in the Berlin bunker. But they're saying, no, he escaped. He escaped. He wound up in Indonesia. And I thought, yeah, right, okay. A little later, somebody that I know, Dr. Nick Bellantoni, who's the state archaeologist of Connecticut, went to Moscow to look at the skull the Russians claimed was Hitler's skull. And he came back, and we had a discussion about this, but of course he became well known for doing participating in a documentary on this on the History Channel. He discovered that skull was not even the skull of a man, it was the skull of a woman, the wrong age. And they did some testing on it, on a particle, piece of the skull that he brought back with him. And the testing shows that had nothing to do with Adolf Hitler. The skull the Russians have been saying all these years was the skull of Hitler, is not. And when that happened, I sat back and I thought to myself, well, then wait a minute. What forensic evidence does exist that Hitler died in the bunker? Maybe I better look at this Indonesian story a little bit more closely. And then I started seeing documentation. People were showing me papers about this. They were showing me all sorts of strange documents in German that were found, that were in the possession of this weird guy who lived on this remote island in Indonesia, far to the east of Bali. I mean, we're talking remote, very difficult to get to. And I'm putting this together and I'm thinking, there's something to it. I mean, in this guy's writings, he's referring to Krunoslav Dragonovic, which is a mouthful. But Dragonovic goes back to what you were saying before. This was the man who created the rat lines. This was a Croatian priest, a Catholic priest, who tried to save the entire Croatian puppet government, the Ustashi puppet government that were Nazis, tried to save them, to move them out of Croatia where they were about to be arrested, got them out through northern Italy, through the monastery route, as we call it now, through a series of churches and convents and whatnot, got them fake papers, and got them on a ship going to Argentina. They were some of the first war criminals to have escaped and wound up in Argentina using the monastery route, using the rap lines. It's Dragonovic who created this, and he created it working hand in hand with Allied intelligence. When the war was over, the CIC, the Counterintelligence Corps, had a base in Salzburg, Austria, and he worked with them out of that base. At first, the Americans wanted to capture Nazis and prosecute them. But by 1946, going into 47, everything changed. They knew they were going to have problems with the Soviet Union, so they were looking for Nazis not to prosecute them, but to hire them and to protect them, to make them work for Allied intelligence. So suddenly, Draganovich, this crazed Nazi Monsignor in the Catholic Church, a defender of Nazism, a virulent anti-Semite and anti-communist, suddenly becomes basically a guy working for the CIA. First for American military intelligence, then for the CIA. Now he's moving people out of the country like mad. Josef Mengele got out this way. Fritz Stangl got out this way. Klaus Barbie, all the big names of the Nazi hierarchy, the most wanted war criminals, got out with this man's assistance, with Draganovich's assistance out of Austria. Now I'm looking at some old papers. I'm in Singapore and in Indonesia. I'm looking at some old documents. I mean, the originals, not just photocopies. And I'm looking at this guy talking about Draganovich. He has the address, where to find him in Rome, where to find him, where the safe house is in Genoa. He's got all of this information. This old guy who died in 1970 in Indonesia, he had all the documentation on the rat lines before anybody knew the rat lines really existed. This was before Klaus Barbie had been arrested in the 1980s, when suddenly everybody heard about the rat lines, and Draganovich, the name Draganovich, became famous. This paperwork dates back to the 1940s. This guy got out of Europe, wound up in Indonesia, the same age as Hitler, the same height as Hitler, with a handlebar mustache, and with his blonde wife. And they wind up in Jakarta around 1952. And then from Jakarta, Jakarta, of course, is the capital of Indonesia. From there, they wind up on this remote island called Sumbawa Besar. And it's in the middle of nowhere. And he winds up there running a clinic, a medical clinic. Now, this freaked me out for another reason. You've read Unholy Alliance, so you know that in 1979, I went to Chile. I was detained by a group of Nazis down there at a place called Colonia Dignidad. Yeah. And Colonia Dignidad, of course, is rather famous now. I mean, it's becoming more famous. People are talking about it. But in those days, their claim to fame for the local people was they ran a clinic, right? So they ran this clinic on their estate, this vast estate they had in the Andes Mountains. And these were Nazis. These are people who had escaped justice. They served as a safe house for people like Walter Rauff, Otto Skorzeny, Joseph Mengele. Everybody had passed through Colonia Dignidad at one point. It was a beautiful place, idyllic, in the middle of nowhere, and protected by the Chilean government. So I had blundered into the place in 79. That's another story. But the idea that they ran a clinic, and now this guy's running a clinic on this island, this kind of weird coincidence started to make me pay attention. And as I started digging, I came to the conclusion that whether or not this guy was Hitler, he was somebody. He was some famous war criminal. He was somebody that they were looking for, someone that had to be found. And it led me into the story about Hitler's escape, the possibility that he did escape. And then I started researching the British files on this, the American files, all the historical statements that have been made, newspaper clippings, and all the rest of it. And I came to the conclusion that there's absolutely no way to know for sure that Hitler died in the bunker, that the story we were told was told by British Secret Service, a guy called Hugh Trevor Roper, a famous historian who, by the way, didn't speak German, did not have access to the American or the Soviet German prisoners from the bunker, only to the ones the British had. And he had 3 months, only 3 months, to come up with a story that Hitler committed suicide in the bunker on April 30th, 1945. Nothing more to see here. Move along. He was given that job. He had 3 months to do it. And he did it in 3 months, made a big presentation. We have discovered, to our satisfaction, Hitler died in the bunker. No problem. He's dead. Forget all about it. Don't go looking. Well, yeah, but no. The eyewitness reports were all contradictory. Okay, Even the British, their own people couldn't agree. And then when you started matching it to what the prisoners the Americans had, the prisoners the Soviets had, who changed their story completely with every beating and interrogation, and suddenly you realize nobody said anything. I mean, what possible reason would SS have to lie about Hitler's death, right? Of course they're going to lie about it. They're going to lie like crazy. Oh, he took cyanide. Oh, he shot himself. Oh, somebody else shot him. On and on, all these stories.
Or we heard the gunshot. We did, honest, in the bunker.
We did. We heard it. We heard a gunshot. It's World War II. It's Berlin in April 1945. You heard a lot of gunshots. You know, it was constant. There was a rain of bullets going on out there. So the story was they cremated the bodies. The Soviets came, however, SMERSH, the famous counterintelligence people for Soviet military, they came and they claimed they found the bodies. Well, they found Goebbels and his wife and their 6 children and their dog.
Nice touch.
And they found those bodies. Nice touch.
As you put it.
And yeah, so they got those bodies. Then they claimed they had Hitler and Eva Braun. The problem with that was the first body they came up with was not Hitler. It was Hitler's double. Hitler had 2 doubles that we know of because, as I say, he did not appear in public after July 44. But a double would occasionally appear. Somebody kind of looked like Hitler and then disappeared again. So they found a double. They found another double in another town. They didn't really find Hitler, but they found these bodies. The identification that this is Hitler and Eva Braun is made on the basis of dental records, which is pretty funny because 2 weeks before the end of the war, Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun decide they have to go to the dentist and get new dentures made. So they go to the dentist. I mean, the war is falling. Everyone's dying. They need new dentures. So they go and they get dentures. But they get 2 sets each of dentures, each one. One set was found in the mouths of these 2 corpses that they found outside the Reichschancellery in Berlin. They didn't fit, but it didn't matter. The Soviets were satisfied, oh, this must be Hitler and Eva Braun. But let's go and let's make sure. Let's find the dentist who did that. Well, they couldn't find the dentist. But they did find somebody who worked for the dentist and from memory drew exactly what the dentures should have looked like. Right? This guy, you know. So
how convenient. That is great.
How convenient.
Yeah.
And the drawings work. They're perfect. Of course, this must be Hitler and Eva. Where's the other set of dentures? Right? No one knows. 2 sets of dentures, but only one was found. Well, the Soviets now take up these bodies, and this is the weirdest thing of all. They drive around with these bodies in the back of a truck for like days and days. They'll drive someplace, they'll bury the bodies, a day or so later come back, dig them up, drive them around again. This is in the Russians' own documents, their own words.
Right.
You know, this is the Hitler book that they put out a couple of years ago. So they're driving these bodies around like crazy. So they finally decide to bury the bodies once and for all in Magdeburg at the KGB headquarters there. There's a parking lot. They bury them in the ground, pave it over, and now there's the new Soviet intelligence headquarters for that part of Germany, East Germany, at Magdeburg is there, and now the bodies are there. Everybody can forget about them. It's done. Okay, go back to Indonesia. Why is this important, the story? Because in January of 1970, our man in Germany, this strange doctor who's not really a doctor, breaks his habit of never leaving the island. He never leaves that remote island. He's paranoid about the Allies. He decides he's going to go for some reason to the city of Surabaya on the coast. The story given doesn't make any sense. He has a patient, and the patient is having heart trouble. He wants to take the patient to this hospital in Surabaya. However, there's a note left behind in his belongings that says he has a meeting with somebody at a hotel in Surabaya in January of 1970. We don't know what this is all about. He winds up in Surabaya, a guy who never wanted to leave that island because he's paranoid for security. On the day he arrives in Surabaya, he winds up himself in the hospital. No one knows how he suddenly got sick. The next day he dies. I'm working on the assumption he was summoned to Surabaya by someone on some pretense and murdered, quite frankly, killed in Surabaya. Whether it was Mossad doing this because they knew who this guy was, who knows?
Right.
But he was called up there and he dies. I mean, he was fine as long as he stayed on his island. He was right. If he left the island, he would be killed. He left the island. He died. That's in January of 1970. By April of 1970, Yuri Andropov, now head of the KGB, before he becomes premier of the Soviet Union, Andropov is head of the KGB. In April of 70, he gives the order to his people, go to Magdeburg, dig up the bodies of Hitler and Eva Braun, and cremate them again and sprinkle the ashes in the river. Shortly after word comes to Russia that this guy has been murdered in Indonesia, suddenly the KGB is in a hurry to destroy this evidence that everybody forgot even existed. Right?
That's right.
Andropov says, go and dig up these bodies. Actually tear up the parking lot, the paved parking lot, dig down, get these bodies, which have now been decomposed to the point where it's disgusting, and they're going to take them out to a place and burn them, cremate them again, but do it right this time, and then scatter the ashes. That's in April of 1970. So what is going on? What is all this? It's a very suggestive story. And as I started researching more and more, it got more and more crazy. It involved gold. It involved something called Sukarno's Revolutionary Fund. It was gold being shipped around to support a sort of competitor to the IMF and to the World Bank that was going to be run by Sukarno and his non-aligned nations, neither the communists nor the capitalists. He was going to create this sort of operation that they wouldn't have to rely upon the IMF. All of this politics is going on all around the same time. So this is, Sukarno's overthrown in 65, the year of living dangerously. Suharto comes in. He's trying to get a hold of the Revolutionary Fund. All of this is going on. But in the middle of all of this, in 65, that famous year when they made a movie about that too, in which, Sukarno was basically overthrown because the generals believed he was working with the Chinese communists to take over the country and turn it into a communist state. During that same year, our guy in Germany, this strange Austrian guy with the handlebar mustache, the famous island of Bali, a beautiful resort island, and spends time there in Bali, coming back and reporting how great everything was and how beautiful it was. And he was glad to meet some of his old comrades. Mm. Well, in 1965 in Bali, records coming out of that part of the world say that tens of thousands of people were murdered during that massive purge that took place in 1965, the anti-communist purge.
Oh, yeah.
Tens of thousands. Estimates go as high as 100 or 200,000 people were murdered on the island of Bali alone. And that's the time he decides he's going to go to Bali and hang out, right? So the connection between this man, whoever he was, and the Indonesians, many Indonesians swear this was Hitler, the connection between this guy and the destruction of communists on the island of Bali and his access to the gold that was supposed to be used for the Revolutionary Fund, Nazi gold. All of this comes together to suggest that we may be talking about Hitler. And if not Hitler, then somebody who had Hitler's contacts, had Hitler's access to funds, and was just as ideologically fanatic as Hitler was, and who had the same mustache, quite frankly.
And he also had, this being the same person in Indonesia, and you mentioned his address book,
Yep.
his, the Ace flyer, Rudel?
Oh, yeah, Hans Ulrich Rudel, yes.
Right, okay. So, I mean, motive, means, opportunity, methods, everything, basically to get to where he needed to go. And then, of course, and I found this fascinating too, folks. If you think about this, 1965 Bali, think about what happened there, the purge of the communists, and then, of course, the strange, as you point out, the strange situation in 1970 with surrounding this man's death. And you identify this man in your book. And again, his book, in this particular book, The Hitler Legacy, you identify him by name, and also you show a picture of his gravesite too, right? I mean, yeah.
Well, yeah, I went to visit the grave because I wanted to see it for myself. He was buried right there in Surabaya. Muslim tradition is you bury a body within 24 hours. They weren't going to ship him back to his island, so they buried him there in Surabaya. And what is bizarre about his gravestone is that it was missing the dates.
That's right.
So you have the name. His name allegedly was Georg Anton Poch. That's P-O-umlaut-C-H. And they had him there as Dr. He was posing as a medical doctor if he wasn't a doctor. So he had his name, Dr. Georg Antenpois, and then birth date blank.
Right.
Even the date of death blank. Nobody put in the dates. Now, there's not a single gravestone in that cemetery, and it's a big cemetery, and I walked it. There's no gravestones without dates on them. It's just not the tradition. And this was a traditional Muslim gravestone. The dates are missing. That's spooky. That's not done. That's incredible.
But
they didn't. Okay.
Are we to believe?
They didn't know what he was.
But are we to believe? You said there was a Muslim cemetery. Are we to believe that this man became a Muslim?
Oh, he did.
Oh.
He converted to Islam. His wife, this nice blonde Austrian lady, after decided she had had enough of Indonesia or Sumbawa or whatever. And in 1964, I believe it was in 64, she leaves the country forever. She goes back to Europe and disappears. Quite frankly, haven't been able to find her since. But about a year later or so, around the time of the Bali massacre, he marries a local Indonesian woman who was Muslim. Now, Islamic law says a Muslim man can marry anyone. She doesn't have to be Muslim as long as the children are brought up Muslim.
Mr.
But
Levin,
a Muslim woman, yes.
Can you hold that thought? We're at the top of the hour break. And this would be a great place to break and pick up on the other side. Hitler escaping to Indonesia and becoming Muslim.
Yeah, I'm telling you, you got to read this book, The Hitler Legacy. Fantastic documentation. We'll be right, ladies and gentlemen, to this Monday edition, Monday, March 14th, 2016. We're coming to you from Chicago on our way to hear the Watchman Conference in Dallas. I apologize, I appear to be losing my voice. But the second, during the second hour, we played a portion of Peter Levenda's appearance last week. And it's amazing for me, folks, to listen to Peter Levenda and to see the influence that the Nazi ideology had in the globalization or the weaponization of global jihad. Now we are getting into some historical aspects of Hitler and of the Nazis. What we're going to do, I think, is we're going to play the remainder of the third hour. And again, I would urge everyone to listen to this in the context of current events. Think, for example, how the current events are being molded after this particular ideology. Now, I understand people are quick and many times erroneous to say, well, this is a Nazi ideology, this or that, when comparing various events that are taking place currently. However, you've got to, and I truly believe you got to understand the backstory, the agenda that was put in motion well over a half a century ago by the very, some say neocons. I don't think that's the proper terminology, but by the globalists, by the planners, by the people who are doing this, who are subjecting the United States to things like the alien invasion, the invasion of aliens in this country, taking Christianity out of schools. And remember, folks, that Hitler proclaimed himself to be a Christian, but he introduced positive Christianity and really bastardized the Christian religion. So please listen to the remainder of this interview with that in mind, in the context of upcoming and current events. Peter Levenda being continued from last week. Here it is. Go ahead and pick up where you left off, sir.
Well, we were talking about Islamic marriage situation.
Yes.
And
yes.
For a Muslim woman, she must only marry a Muslim man. A Muslim man can marry any kind of religious person, but a woman, if she's a Muslim, must marry a Muslim man. So since they were going to get married, our Dr. Cook then converted to Islam and became a Muslim, at least nominally, in order to go through with this marriage ceremony. And he got married, and it was shortly thereafter, within a couple of years, he was in Surabaya on a slab in the morgue. He was dead. And then she started, his wife, his second wife, his Muslim wife, started to kind of not talk to people and disappear. And when I tried to look up what was going on with her and try to find her, I located her in a different part of Indonesia, and the place where I was told she was located, it was basically a compound. I mean, there was no way for me to just walk up and knock on the door.
And you've had your fill of compounds by this time, okay, right?
Oh yeah, compound, sure. Another compound I didn't need. So I don't know. I mean, that part of the story, she had given interviews to a couple of people back in the 80s about this, and then pretty much kind of got quiet and disappeared. So as far as she is concerned, the testimony she gave, he told her, this Austrian doctor, told her he was Hitler. I mean, she didn't know very much about World War II. She didn't know very much about Hitler. She kind of knew the name. But he said, yeah, I'm Hitler. You're looking at him, and told her this. And then she reported it to someone else, and eventually it became a story. But in the 1980s, an Indonesian doctor followed up this story. And he started collecting information because he had met this guy accidentally back in 1960 when he was going onto that remote island as part of a medical project, and found him and talked to him and thought he was very strange. Didn't seem to be a doctor. Didn't seem to have a medical knowledge really. And then he died, and he started to put the pieces together, and he came to the conclusion this could have been Hitler based on a number of things. So then the German government was sending people to talk to him. They offered him millions of dollars for the documents that were in his possession, that the doctor had in his possession. That diary I mentioned, and some of the other documentation that he refused. He refused to sell them or part with them. And it was only later, a couple of years ago, that I started to actually see them for myself.
Yeah, you saw this well, I
yes.
don't know if I'd call it memorabilia, but folks, I mean, think about this. We have with us a guy that, now see, 30 years as an investigator. Why can't I get a case like this? All right. It's because I didn't stick my nose into this. All right. Like Mr. Lavenda did. So Mr. Lavenda actually saw the documents that he's referencing right now, or at least most of them. Go ahead.
Yeah, I did. I saw them, and this is what happened. I published Ratline, which was my story about my discovery of this guy in Indonesia and all the material that I come up with to that point. And it was because of Ratline that the person who owns the documents now got in touch with me and said, "Listen, we have to talk." So I went out to Singapore in this case and sat down, and I saw the passports, I saw the actual documents. I put together, what was going on, the chronology, the timeline. There's a very good chance that the person who was in Indonesia, if he wasn't Hitler, he was somebody that they would have wanted as a war criminal. Let's put it this way. So since Redline got published, I got contacted by these guys with documents, and then I got contacted by people around the world who had some knowledge of who this guy was, and people who were friends of the family, and all the rest of it, and the mysterious things that happened and how they dropped out of sight. And so there's a greater mystery that's been unfolding in the years since I published Ratline and Hitler Legacy, and it's still unfolding. I'm still getting information, very solid information from people who were there, or who knew who these people were, or who had some access to it. And one person in particular went through my two books, Ratline and Hitler Legacy, and noticed something I didn't, that one of the strange notations from that notebook that I write about in Ratline is actually referenced in Hitler Legacy in a different context entirely. And when this person told me this, who doesn't want their name mentioned, I looked at the two things, and I thought, oh my goodness, the guy who went to Indonesia, this Austrian, and his wife actually had access to the famous Sukarno Revolutionary Fund, and we're talking millions upon millions of dollars worth of gold. So they had the bank account. I mean, they had access to the Nazi gold. And who would have access to that gold unless there was someone extremely trusted by the Nazi hierarchy, somebody who had carte blanche, someone who could be trusted to have access to that kind of money. So more and more pieces are falling into place. And against the backdrop of all of this, there's another weaponization of Islam taking place, and that's during the Cold War. And now we're fighting the Soviet Union. It's the 1950s. when these people wind up in Indonesia, at the same time, we have the CIA in Germany trying to figure out how can we set up a front within the Soviet Union to help topple that regime. And the only thing they could think of was, well, let's look at Central Asia, which is under the Soviet sphere of influence, and realize that we're talking about Muslims. Is there some way, and this is coming from the top, this was coming from Eisenhower, president at the time, who said, why can't we convince the Muslims to have a holy war against the atheistic communists? Can we do something to get these guys together and rise up against the Soviets? And here we are making the same mistake the third time in a row. We weaponize Islam, and that's what we do. We send the CIA. They open up this operation in Germany. They build a mosque in Munich, which is going to be used now by the Muslim Brotherhood and everybody else, right? And we're forcing people who despise each other, once again, the Central Asians, all the various Central Asian Muslim communities who never get along. They don't speak the same language. They don't have the same traditions. All they have in common is the Quran, and that's about it. And now we're forcing them into a kind of military union against the Soviets in the name of Islam. And then we go and do the same thing the Nazis tried to do with no real result the first two times, the Germans, I should say, the first two times. And now we're going in the 1950s. I mean, the blood is barely dried from World War II, and now we're going to go in and do the same thing. And this, again, is part of the documentation. The guy who was running the Muslim Brotherhood at the time is at a meeting attended by President Eisenhower. We're all good friends, et cetera, et cetera. And there's this, all these intrigues going on in Eastern Europe and Central Europe and in Germany to get the Muslims to work together. And the Muslim Brotherhood, of course, gets in the middle of all of this. And then we basically create the Taliban, we create all these groups to go in after the Soviets in the name of religion.
Hey, it's a big new. Hey, it's a big new. I got an idea. It's a brand new idea. Yeah, well, let's get the Muslims and let's arm them and yeah.
That'll work.
What could possibly go wrong? And see, folks, are you getting it now? Why history is so important? I mean, to me anyway. And I'm not trying to talk down to anyone. I'm just really trying to reinforce the point that can you hear why this is so important? Because it happened. I mean, again, what could possibly go wrong? Anyone who studies history would know. I mean, see, Mr. Levenda could be Secretary of State, and just ask him, and he'd say, "Yeah, you kidding me? No, ain't gonna happen." Yeah, I got to ask you this because I know right before the show we touched on this and you kind of said, no. But let me ask you this. I'm going to kind of twist your arm a little bit. I've been doing a lot of research on Obama and his connections, but more importantly, the OSS to CIA to Obama through Kennedy and Nixon and kind of this convoluted investigation I've been doing. And I told you, so looking at Subud, okay. Now you had mentioned this perk, this doctor, the O with the umlaut, POCH, in Indonesia during the Sukarno deposing and such. Now, Subud played a role in that politically, not religiously, but the political arm did somewhat, sort of, kind of. You still don't think? I mean, folks, in case you don't know what I'm talking about, because Subud, to me, and Mr. Levenda, this is just my view based on my research. I do believe Subud is an organization that was influenced and infiltrated by what is now the CIA, and then assets before that, and of course there was some shenanigans, being played in Indonesia, which was why I bring up this point, because Subud have been even possibly played a part into the Nazi / Sukarno-Suharto situation. I'll just let you say yes or no or shut up.
Well, I mean, you have to understand Indonesia. Indonesia is a crazy place, man. Okay. In Indonesia, anything is possible, and strange things happen there. It's not monolithic. Different areas of Indonesia do things differently. You have I wrote a book called Tantric Temples. I crawled all over Hindu and Buddhist temples in Indonesia. Most of them, covered with vegetation and all the rest of it, but people are still burning incense there. This is an Islamic country. This is a Muslim country where it's okay to go to an old ancient, I'm talking more than 1,000 years old, ancient Buddhist or Hindu temple, and burn incense in front of a linga and yoni statue, which I won't go into details for your more nervous listeners, but let's put it this way, it's a fertility symbol. And they can go and incense sticks there and all the rest of it, and flowers there, and not run into problems with their Muslim associates, their family and friends. Indonesia's a different thing. They're not so polarized. So you can be a Muslim and still believe in ghosts and spirits and going to cemeteries and having sex in a cemetery in the middle of the night with a complete stranger in order to get good luck in the future. This stuff goes on. Okay. So when you talk about Subud is a mystical movement that came out of Indonesia, which had Indonesian leaders. And in Indonesia, if you become even moderately powerful, you're going to have political connections. You may have connections to some elements of the police or the army. That's just the way it is. It's all very local. So if you're prominent in your village, you're going to be prominent not just in terms of a religious thing, but maybe in terms of business, maybe in terms of politics. Oh. So these things get mixed together a lot in a big pot. So there's a lot of spillover. The leadership of Subud, because they're running an organization which is international, they're going to be very careful about political associations. They're going to be very aware of them. But they're going to be very careful to distance themselves, not wanting to be identified with one particular political party or another, because that would damage their brand, let's put it that way. Would there be CIA infiltration of Subud? You bet. Why not? Of course there would be. They're an international organization. It's prime for CIA to have somebody embedded inside. And not just CIA. I imagine the Chinese do and the Soviets do and everyone else.
Oh, yeah.
Because it has that kind of reach, and it does have a lot of very sort of influential followers, people who are, better educated, sort of elite, on and on like that. I mean, it is a very strange little operation when you compare it to other religions and, mystical movements around the world. It's been around for a very long time. And there's this, there's a lot of crossover. So there's going to be, as there was with the Catholic Church, the church was one of the major defenders of the rap lines and getting the war criminals out of Europe. We think of the Catholic Church, as the church. It's a religious institution, but that's for the people like us down below here. We look up and we just see the church, and we think that's all it is. You get a little bit deeper inside the church, you realize it's a banking operation, it's a military operation, it's a political operation. So, they had a vested interest in moving Nazi war criminals into South America because the Nazi war criminals were anti-communist. The Catholic Church was anti-communist. They made common cause, just like the Nazis and the Palestinian liberation people made common cause because they were both against Israel. As far as the church was concerned, if you're against Israel, no big deal. They don't have a dog in that race, really. They don't much care. At least they didn't in the 1940s and 1950s. But you had to be anti-communist. So when you're talking about Subud, for Subud to survive, it had to survive under Suharto, who was one of the most repressive dictators Indonesia has ever known. So he overthrew Sukarno basically on a trumped-up charge. His generals got together, took over the country, massacred millions of people throughout Indonesia. They're still trying to count the bodies today.
Suharto.
They're still coming up.
Right.
Suharto.
Right. Okay.
So we're still coming up with documentaries based on this, interviews with survivors. I've met survivors of the Suharto purges. I've talked to them. I know the horrors they went through. People being imprisoned for no reason. Being in prison for 20, 30 years. So for Subud to survive under those circumstances, they had to play ball with Suharto to some extent. And playing ball with Suharto meant playing ball with CIA. There's no way out.
Okay.
There's no way out.
Yeah.
CIA was vested in getting rid of Sukarno since the 1950s. Okay, they were trying to run operations against Sukarno in the 1950s. I mean, CIA hated him. They wanted him out no matter what. And so their involvement in the year of living dangerously, 1965, is documented. We know this went on. There's no doubt in anyone's mind.
Okay.
The Catholic Church was heavily invested. and having Suharto take over and getting rid of Sukarno, and so was the CIA. Very heavily invested. And you know who was on the beach in the Philippines getting ready to invade Indonesia in the 1950s? You're not going to believe this. Lee Harvey Oswald.
I know. I'm so tickled. You know, I am so tickled to get the folks. I got the upper hand because, well, I've got in front of me a copy of the Hitler Legacy. I bet you want one too, don't you? You see, folks, I'm serious about this. The Hitler Legacy. Go to Amazon or your bookstore and get this book. It's got so much information in it, rich information. Did you hear what Peter Levenda just said? See, I really think all elementary schools should have this, teach this in history class. I really do. That's just my view. So, okay, Lee Harvey Oswald is in the Hitler Legacy. Go figure. Okay, go continue, sir.
Well, at that time, Lee Harvey Oswald was in the Marines, and the CIA was calling up an entire, military operation. They were going to invade Indonesia in the 1950s. They were getting ready to do that. And there was a flyer, sort of shades of Francis Gary Powers. There was a pilot who crashed in Indonesia and kind of exposed the operation a little bit too soon. But they were ready to go, and Oswald was part of that unit. He was going to be actually in Indonesia invading to get rid of Sukarno. Now, an interesting story is we have his notebooks from later when he got out of the Marines and he came back from Russia. And we find out that he's made notations about Sukarno, and thinking that Sukarno really wasn't a communist, he was more of an opportunist, which is exactly the CIA's point of view. They understood this. They understood he was playing both sides against the middle, but they wanted somebody who was going to be more solidly on their side, somebody they could rely upon 100%, and that was going to be Suharto. Sukarno was playing both ends against the middle. He was an opportunist. The CIA's own people, going back to the beginning of the CIA, really, to the late 1940s, early 1950s, came up with that same analysis, that Sukarno is not a communist. He wasn't a Nazi either. I mean, he made speeches supporting Japan's invasion and supporting Hitler during World War II. So how suddenly does he become a communist, right? But anyway, they saw him as this opportunist, and they didn't trust him. They wanted to get rid of him. And Oswald knew this intimately and wrote about it in his own works and talked about it among friends that he had in New Orleans and in Texas, saying, Sukarno really wasn't that bad. He was just an opportunist and he was in the way. So there's Oswald, which I find is just a mind-blowing idea. Oswald in the Philippines getting ready to invade Indonesia. It's just one of these weird things that just.
When I got your book and I was reading it, and I remember when I got to the part two, and this was a while back. I was sitting next to the fireplace, and I started just laughing actually, and I was with my wife, and it was quiet in the family room, and she said, "What are you laughing at?" I mean, I'm reading a book, The Hitler Legacy, and I started laughing. She thinks I'm a sick man, and I said, "No, you're not going to believe this," and I told her the story, which you have, I think it's on page 109 or something. But yeah, I mean, the things that you have found just absolutely blow my mind. I got a question from a listener, and I'm going to toss this out to you. It kind of goes back to what you were talking about before, and he wants to know. His name's Byron. Wants to know how convinced you are. Now, the man, the Austrian that you believe was Hitler, P umlaut over the O-C-H. I took 3 years of Hitler, and I can't even pronounce an umlaut at all. Okay, or 3 years of German. Did I say 3 years of Hitler?
Yes, 3 years of Hitler.
Yeah. Let's lay off the coffee, man. All right. Anyway, how convinced are you that he was that was Hitler as opposed to Nazi Party Secretary Martin Bormann?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm not 100% convinced this was Hitler. One thing I'm convinced, we don't know he died in the bunker. The possibility that he escaped is very high. The Russians never had him, so we have to go back to square one. And as an investigator, as somebody who relies upon evidence and documents, I have to say the jury's out. We don't know that Hitler died in the bunker. We really don't have any evidence to that effect. And this guy in Indonesia, as I say, he had tremendous access. He had access to the rat lines at a time when nobody knew who they were, so he obviously was connected. The rest of the address book that I saw contained names of some very famous people. well-known names. He's very well connected to a lot of people who wound up in South America, others who escaped to other places. This guy was deeply connected. And then when he gets to Indonesia, he's got access to millions of dollars of gold, which explained to me one problem that I had with him. How did he survive, on that remote island all those years? I mean, they didn't have enough money on that island to pay him, for medical care, and he wasn't really a doctor. He has the actual Georg Anton Vogt, the real one, was not even a medical doctor himself. He was sort of a medical academician. He was an academic medical guy, but he wasn't a guy that you would go to for, a broken leg or something. He wasn't that kind of doctor, but he had a medical status within the Nazi Party. He was the chief medical officer for Salzburg during World War II, if it's the same guy. And that guy was responsible for euthanasia programs and everything else. He would have been a war criminal. They would have wanted to prosecute him if they got a hold of him.
Right.
But another famous Nazi guy called Kaltenbrunner, who was second in command of the SS, he also tried to escape Germany as a doctor. And he had medical bag with him, and he had medical documents of a real doctor on him when they captured him. Not fake documents of a real doctor. So my theory is whoever wound up in Indonesia had the documents of the real Georg Anton Koch, wound up in Indonesia with these fake documents, and pretended to be that guy for the rest of his life.
And you laid out your hypothesis, your thesis, your assertions extremely well, very well documented in your book, The Hitler Legacy, which I cannot recommend highly enough. This is a fabulous book by our guest, Peter Levenda, his website, peterlevenda.com. Now, I got to tell you, folks, we got him just for another half hour, and he's working on a very important project, secret project. He won't tell me what it is, but it's something that's going to be extremely important. So keep an eye on Peter Levenda, okay? And keep him in your prayers, too, okay? Whatever you do, keep him in your prayers, because we got to keep him around. Whatever he's working on, he didn't even tell me. Promised I wouldn't tell everybody. Of course, he said no. Can't tell you. So whatever he's working on, it's important. So keep him in your prayers. If we can just change direction just a tad, because I want to get into something else here. Joe, when was it? Last October, I think it was, or sometime last year. You and I were in Newark, Ohio. Or is that where we were?
Yeah, that was
Newark.
Yeah, that was last year. That was the fall of last year.
All right. Folks, Peter Levenda has an entirely vast set of work, different than what we're talking about, called Sinister Forces. 3 books. Book 1 is The Nine. It's a grimoire of American political witchcraft, and boy, I'll tell you what a accurate description of that is. Book 2 is A Warm Gun, and Book 3 is The Secrets of the Manson.
Secret.
Yeah. Okay, so we're kind of cutting in the middle of all this, because on this program we talk about the importance of the influence of counterculture in this country and such. But boy, you get into some interesting stuff when you talk about serial killers, Charles Manson, and your trip, that pretty harrowing trip that you took by car. And I was right there with you. You described it so well. The computer on your car seat, driving through the mountains and in a rainstorm. You know what I'm talking about, right? Into
West Virginia to Kentucky.
Yes. All right. So anyway, what I was saying is we were at we had a conference where we were taking a look at some of these really odd. What are they, Joe?
The mounds.
The mounds.
The mounds,
right.
They're called.
Right. But you had, Mr. Levin, you had made some connections between the areas there, some of the artifacts there, and serial killers that include, but are not limited to, Charles Manson. Boy, what's going on with that? Tell us about that.
Well, as I say in Sinister Forces, America, our country, is a kind of haunted house. There were civilizations living in this country, on this land, long before Columbus, of course, but even long before the people we now consider Native Americans. There were cultures that built mounds, earthworks, right? Mm-hmm. Elaborate earthworks. In one case, with higher volume than the Great Pyramid of Giza. Some of these earthworks are vast in size. They were part of a network. You're talking about Newark, Ohio. Ohio, of course, is replete with these earthworks. And what we do is we build on top of them. And what we tend to build on top of these earthworks, in places like Chillicothe, is a penal institution. It's a penitentiary. In Moundsville, West Virginia, another penitentiary. And the place is called Moundsville, because it's replete with these mounds. And yet we built a prison. Squeaky Frumme, who was part of the Manson family, was incarcerated in Moundsville. Henry Lee Lucas, famous killer, perhaps a serial killer, we don't know because he lied a lot. But he was incarcerated at Chillicothe, and I believe that Manson spent some time at Chillicothe too, or in environs around there somewhere. So you have a weird connection between the burial mounds and our preference, for some reason, of building prisons on or near these mounds. So I started looking at that and trying to figure out what's really going on here. And then I realized that in Ashland, Kentucky, which is where Manson basically grew up, spent the first part of his childhood there, there are burial mounds in the middle of the town of Ashland. In fact, it's their park, their so-called Central Park. There are all these burial mounds there, Indian burial mounds. And I didn't know this till I actually drove into Ashland because I was basically searching for Manson's background and, how he grew up, these circumstances. And the first thing you see as you drive in is Ashland Petroleum, which is just belching, fumes throughout the entire state and across the whole Ohio River Valley, it looks like. And then you pass by Ashland Petroleum and you wind up in Ashland proper. And it's a kind of a spooky place, and the Judds came from there. Naomi Judd is from there. It's a country western connection to Ashland, which is very strong. Chuck Woolery, he came from there. So it's not like this really weird, remote, the love connection, yeah. So it's not Silent Hill, you know what I mean? It's an actual, thriving community, but the burial mounds freaked me out. So I'm looking at this and I'm thinking Charlie, played on these mounds. Charlie was soaking up the vibes from all of this ancient civilization that was there. And no archaeologist has actually done anything about these mounds. No one really knows. They're supposedly one of the oldest cultures in America, the Adena culture, they call it, which goes back to, 800 years before Christ. So we're talking about an ancient culture, which is as old as Buddhism, was in Ashland and in places along the Ohio River Valley. It's an incredible thing to think about. So I started to research the town, and I'm thinking, what's going on here? And near the mounds, there's this huge building, a huge, sort of an apartment building. And on top of the apartment building, there are two griffins, just these statues of griffins. And if you stand by and you look at it, it looks like the Ark of the Covenant with the mercy seat on top. And I thought, well, that's strange. So I look it up, and in the Ashland Historical Archives, actually, they were considered like to ward off evil spirits or something. It says it in the town brochure. They're not bashful about this at all. And they actually moved that building from its previous location to where it is now, which is pretty much in a line with the burial mounds, the Indian mounds. This entire huge brick building, not a wooden building, but a brick multi-level, multi-apartment building, was lifted up at some point in the past and dragged over to this other location. Why would you do that? This huge building, it wasn't like a small house like you see on the highways with the truck and the flat tops that are going down. This was a huge building. So I thought, that's strange. So I kept digging again, right? What else is there about Ashland? Well, there was the Ashland Massacre. And here was...
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Oh, yes. Oh, yeah, just, weird stuff. So here you have...
Go ahead. And what was this massacre? This is particularly interesting. Go on, sir.
Well, to me, it was fascinating. Christmas Eve in Ashland in the 1860s at some point, if I recall correctly. I don't have the book in front of me. A family, a husband and wife, they leave their kids alone in their house on Christmas Eve. The mother goes one place, the husband goes someplace else. There are two children and one boy, two girls and one boy. The boy is handicapped. He's in a wheelchair. They leave them in this house on Christmas Eve, which to me sounded very strange. Why would you do that on Christmas Eve, right? Anyway, they're left behind. And it turns out they're murdered. Some people got into the house, killed them all, and then set fire to the house on Christmas Eve. Horrible story. right? Something you might find on the ID channel or something. Just 3 kids alone in the house, murdered, and the house burned up Christmas Eve. Well, the local authorities arrest one guy. They think this one guy is involved because he's talking about it in a cafe, and he's kind of slow. But they managed to get him to implicate 2 other people. So now they've got 3 people they think were involved in the killing of these 3 kids. And the town is going crazy. The town wants to lynch them, basically, to kill them on the spot. And they do kill one of them. One of the men is eventually lynched from a sycamore tree. And the other 2 are going to be held over for trial. The government of the state, they send the National Guard, they send troops. They're going to bring these guys on a boat, take them upriver, I think, to Maysville or something in Ohio or up in Kentucky. And they're going to move them along the river and give them a trial in some other town. But the townspeople are not having it. So the townspeople arrange themselves on the docks, and they're trying to keep the boat from leaving with these 2 prisoners aboard. And the troops on board the ship open fire on the civilians and kill a few and wound a lot of others. I mean, it turns into this horrible scene, and it's the Ashland Massacre. And it's over the fact that these 3 kids were killed. We don't know what the motive was. There's the story that the girls were molested before they were killed. The boy was in the wheelchair and couldn't do anything about it. And then they killed them and then set fire to the house, etc. But this was strictly a crime of opportunity of these guys. Then there was a whole effort by the newspapers in Cincinnati, which is right across the river from Kentucky, of course. They're saying that they have the wrong people, that it's trumped up, that these are not the right people, so on and so forth. And they're attacking Ashland and saying Ashland's acting rashly and all the rest of it. It turned into this horrible, disgusting mess in which a lot of people got killed, other people got wounded, and it was the massacre. And nobody knows about this aspect of American history, right? It's strange, it's convoluted, it's all connected. It was interstate. It involved all these different types of forces. And this is the environment in which Charles Manson grew up, right? So this to me had resonance. It had resonance with a lot of things. You maybe look at Kentucky closely, the way that the Indians used to call Kentucky. The word Kentucky means a dark and bloody ground. Even the Native Americans didn't want to go there. So it had a reputation for being, a place of evil, a place where horrible things happened. So it made me really look at Kentucky, and I spent a lot of time there investigating other aspects of things that were going on weird in Kentucky, including a haunted bar, in another town and everything, and all this other stuff that was going on there. No more than any other state, really. But Manson grew up there right across the river from Ashland in West Virginia. Bobby Joe Long was born and raised. He was a serial killer a little bit after Manson. But they were the 2 towns just face each other across the river. Down a little bit further south, you had Henry Lee Lucas. Yep. So I'm thinking this is like a Bermuda Triangle of serial killers. So I paid a lot of attention to that area and to the burial mounds and to, what's going on. Are we really living in a haunted house? Are there ghosts that we don't understand, that are haunting us from the ground? Civilizations that we're ignoring. You go to Cairo and the pyramids and the Sphinx, everything is there, that ancient culture. But here in this country, we're paving it over. But it's still there. The influences in some way are still there.
Man, this is, folks, you really have to read. I mean, you can hear Mr. Lavenda talking about this, in my view, to read it, and with the intricate and exquisite detail that he gets into this aspect of American history, I don't want to say Native American history, but of our past. It's just an amazing, interwoven, interconnected, intricate puzzle to me. And as an investigator, I ask a lot of questions, and boy, you provide a lot of answers here, or a lot of puzzle pieces. Now, you might not put them all together for all of us, but they're there to be put together. And I would urge everyone to Sinister Forces, the 3 books. Wow, there's just so many questions now. I've got like a million more questions. I can keep you on for like 7 or 8 days. How's your schedule look between until Sunday?
For the next week?
For the next week.
I might have to break for lunch at some point. But...
No, it's all right. Well, I'll tell you what. We've got about 15, 16 minutes left of the program.
I'm going to turn it over to whatever you want to talk about, because we cover a lot of ground. I mean, I've got so many questions. I can't possibly answer them all or ask them all. So out of all of your work, what interests you the most? How's that? I mean, what excites you to talk about? When I say excites you, I mean you find this so interesting and you just want to tell people about your findings or your work, or, have fun with this question. Just, whatever you want to do.
Well, I got involved in all this really in a big way during Watergate, which shows you how old I am. And it was Watergate that really prompted me to start looking more deeply into the relationships that exist between religion and politics. It's that connection, that intersectionality, that really intrigues me, that has intrigued me for a very long time, because we grew up in a kind of compartmentalized society in which religion is kept in a box, and politics is another box, and our business, our livelihood is another box, family is a different box. And we don't always connect these things or see them as part of a continuum. And of course, our Constitution basically protects us against mixing church and state, right? At least as far as the state's concerned, they can't make any laws about that, and set up an establishment of state religion. Okay, we've got it that far, but our political leaders are, by and large, or have been either religious or kind of not so religious. And these ideas, I think, influence their actions. And it's not just us, it's all around the world, it's everywhere. In some cultures, the political leader is the religious leader. Tibet had the Dalai Lama, who was both, political and religious leader. In Japan, the emperor is both. On and on and on. In ancient China, it was the same. Emperors were the sons of heaven. I mean, there was this idea of a divine mandate behind political leaders. And we can make laws all we want to separate that, and we can be very logical about it. We can be very skeptical where these things are concerned and think that we're enlightened and intellectual people. But at a certain level, the one bleeds over into the other. It's sort of inescapable. Religious ideas influence political ideas, and sometimes vice versa. So that led me to studying the Third Reich. I mean, the Nazi Party is a perfect example of a cult. The Nazi Party was a cult. I mean, it was not a political party the way we think of it. It was a cult. And it was a cult based around Hitler, of course, as the avatar, as the Messiah, the leader, the anointed leader of the cult, but also around all of their cultic ideas. Their ideology was very cultic in aspect. The racism, the anti-Semitism, the idea of the land is glorious and the cities are terrible. And all these ideas, all these things made it a religion. I mean, it was going to be a religion. Hitler was going to replace Christianity with the kind of pagan Nazism that he was creating with Heinrich Himmler. And Himmler had created this castle, in Wewelsburg in Germany that I went to, that I visited, which was going to be the headquarters of the cult, of the Nazi cult. And it was based on the Knights of the Round Table, for crying out loud. It was 12 seats around a round table. Mm-hmm. And his top leaders would meet there. I mean, when it was in operation, they would meet there and meditate and go into trance and all this stuff. This is really who we are. We don't automatically separate religion and politics. We do in our discussions, we do in the media and all of these things. But in our darkest, deepest part of ourselves, I think we don't separate those things too much. We're still an ancient people in a sense where our leaders were both political and religious at the same time. Like the Pope, for the Catholics, quite often was a political leader as well as a religious leader. He had armies; they went to war.
Boy, we're seeing that happen now. I mean, I didn't mean to interrupt, but we look at the Pope and look at what the Pope is doing right now. And this is not an indictment against Catholics, folks. If you're a Catholic, please. But you're looking at a structure, really a Pope who's interjecting himself into the political system of America and elsewhere. I understand, I get that. I get the reason. However, when in history have we seen this level of interference, shall we say, or influence? I'm not sure what the word, proper word is, but.
Well, with Francis, it's pretty overt. He's out there. He's in your face. With Pius XII, it was very quiet. Yeah. With Pius XII, he was running Nazis into South America. He was protecting Nazis going to North Africa to fight the Jews. I mean, it was still there. He was still interjecting himself extremely into the political realities at the time. I think they always have one way. Look at John Paul II, right?
Yep.
A very political pope. Very political pope. So you have popes with political ideologies and agendas all the time, and it has an effect. The Pope is the leader of how many hundreds of millions of Catholics, and then you have a billion plus Muslims, and you have on and on and on. This has an effect on our political life and our political understandings. I mean, our view of what Islam is, which is basically a very cracked and fractured view of it. It's not really a good whole view to work with, but our view of Islam is now affecting our political discourse.
That's true
to a large extent, and that's being manipulated. It's weaponizing. So we talk about weaponizing Islam, which has been going on now for 100 years that we know of. Is Christianity being weaponized? We have to ask ourselves these questions. A government that can cynically manipulate religious feelings of anybody is a government you have to really be worried about. You know what I mean?
Very true. And I want to say this. I did not believe when I was thinking about the subject, because I was considering this, and what you wrote in the quotes from your book, especially the Hitler Legacy, about how Islam could be weaponized because, well, Christianity couldn't because it was too wussy, basically. How's that for an intellectual term? Okay, so let's weaponize Islam. However, now folks, let's look at this today, because we could go very far on the other side and think, and to our evangelical listeners, now think about this, because what will be the dangers of Christianity being weaponized to the extent that it becomes it becomes radical. I'll just use that term, but I know I'm going to get emails from this. I know it don't matter, but you make a good point, and I think we might be seeing that happen here to some extent. That's not necessarily too way far on the other side, So
sure, yeah. Well, but I think it's a danger. I think any government or let's say intelligence agency, the CIA was doing this under Eisenhower's instruction, right? They were weaponizing Islam. And the Nazis were weaponizing Islam, and the Germans of the First World War were doing that. They saw the emotions, the religious feelings of people as something that could be manipulated and turned into a tool and turned into a weapon. Well, that can happen to any of us for any reason. We don't have to be Christians or Muslims. We could be Jews. Judaism's been weaponized.
Sure.
We can use any religion, Buddhism. Under the Dalai Lama to a certain extent. I write about the Dalai Lama and Hitler Legacy. A lot of people are nervous about that. How can you attack the Dalai Lama? Well, I'm not really attacking the Dalai Lama. I'm pointing out that he was a political leader who was involved, in asking the CIA for help in sending troops to fight the Chinese communists,
Right.
And he was very chummy with a lot of Nazis. I'm sorry, but it's a fact. He had his picture taken with Heinrich Harrer. He had his picture taken with Miguel Serrano, a very famous Chilean Nazi, a Nazi ideologue who said that Adolf Hitler was the avatar that we were waiting for to cleanse the race, and maybe he's not really dead. He's living on a U-boat in Antarctica or some damn thing. But here is this guy who was an ambassador of Chile to Austria, an ambassador of Chile to India, friend of the Dalai Lama, and a rabid Nazi, Bruno Beger, a friend of the Dalai Lama, who was indicted for war crimes. The guy had almost 100 people killed so he could use their skeletons in an anthropological museum he was setting up during the time of the Third Reich. And he had been on the Tibet expedition in 1938, the SS expedition to Tibet, which took place in 1938. And he befriended the Dalai Lama at that point. He came back after the war and became a major, advocate for the Dalai Lama. And, he was writing, blog articles about how great, Tibet was, how he has fond memories of Tibet, until people said, wait a minute, that's Bruno Beger. This guy had hundreds of people slaughtered during the war, people taken out of the concentration camps and killed so he could mount their skeletons. And then they took his blogs down from the official Dalai Lama website. But this is what you're dealing with. You cannot separate sometimes politics and religion that cleanly, because the people don't let you. People like Beger and Heinrich Harrer,
that's right.
The 7 years in Tibet guy, right? Heinrich Harrer was the guy who did the 7 years in Tibet. They made the movie with Brad Pitt. He was a real person. He was captured. He did wind up in Tibet for a long period of time. But the guy was a Nazi. I mean, he was an officer in the SS. And he was a believer, as I found out later through my own research. This guy never gave up on his Nazi ideals, and yet he remained a friend of the Dalai Lama to the end. So you have this strange juxtaposition. You have popes, befriending Nazis, protecting them against prosecution. You have the Dalai Lama with the Nazis and, fighting the Chinese communists and all of this. It's a very complicated world we live in. It's not as cut and dry as the media would, like you to believe. It's extremely complicated. And if we just march in lockstep, to what we're being told on the news channels, we're marching towards a disaster.
Indeed, we are. Eric, the tech, just handed me about 40 emails. I don't know. It looks like there's about 40 of them here. In about 5 minutes, can you comment? I got 40 people right now. Probably 400 others that want to know your thoughts as quickly as you can on the Kennedy assassination and Watergate connections, or not, or just Kennedy assassination period. The majority of them look like Kennedy assassination questions.
Well, you've read Sinister Forces, so I have a very peculiar relationship to the Kennedy assassination. It gave me an opportunity to see something that others had not seen, simply because they were not, dumb enough to have been involved like I was. But in the 1960s, in 1968, I became involved with a church in the Bronx called the American Orthodox Catholic Church. There's a long story behind this, so we don't have time to get into it, but let's just say I was involved with that church. I actually became a clergyman of that church. And it was the strangest church you'll ever want to see, close to the Bronx Zoo, appropriately off. And it was a church that had no congregation. It was all clergy, bishops, archbishops, priests, etc. It was an Orthodox church.
Go somewhere. Come on.
Well, there you go. It was an Orthodox church. It was run by a former Ukrainian Orthodox priest, which should tell you a lot right there. The Ukrainian Orthodox were extremely divided during World War II. You had one group that was definitely pro-Nazi and working with the Nazis because they were anti-communist. The leader of this group that I was with, the American Orthodox Catholic Church, his name was Profeta, Walter Profeta, or Vladimir Profeta. He had been a Ukrainian priest. He set up his own church, which operated for American intelligence operations. That's why there was no congregation. There were only priests. The priests were being sent in and out on missions. So people would show up from Europe or from Africa when I was there, from during the Biafra crisis, from Nigeria. They get papers. They were ordained or made a bishop or whatever. They would get on the plane the next day and fly back. A lot of strange stuff was going on. I knew there was strange stuff going on. It was 1968. All kinds of strange stuff was going on. But I didn't realize the extent until I started running Sinister Forces, and I was reviewing the Warren Commission stuff and reviewing the House Select Committee on Assassinations, all this stuff, and suddenly the name of this church started coming up. Mm-hmm. And the name of people that I knew started coming up. And I'm thinking, oh my goodness, what is this all about? And then Jim Garrison was writing letters to the House Committee back in the 70s saying, you better look into these churches. I have no idea what they mean, but they're all over the place, and they represent something. I just don't know what it is. And I'm reading this thing, and I'm thinking, oh, Jim, if you were still alive, I could tell you. I started researching these churches for Sinister Forces in a big way. I started going all over the place, talking to whoever was still around, still alive from the churches. And I have their documents. They've sent me letters. I have everything in writing. The church was a front. It was being used by the FBI, the CIA, both, as a means for sending agents abroad as clergymen. David Ferry and Jack Martin were both involved with the church. I have letters from the head of our church, the guy that I knew, asking Jim Garrison to send Jack Martin back. Now, those of you who follow the Kennedy assassinations know that Jack Martin worked with Guy Bannister in New Orleans. He was played by Jack Lemmon in the movie JFK. David Ferry was played by Joe Pesci in the same film. These guys were very involved in clandestine operations, very involved with the intelligence communities, and they were bishops in this church that I belonged to. And all the pieces started to fit together. So the church aspect is one aspect of the story that's never been covered anywhere else. I'm the only one who has, because I happen to have been there. I knew the people involved, and it was only after I could read all the documentation that it all started to fall into place, who was doing what to whom. Then I started talking to the bishops who were still alive. I actually have photographs of Jack Martin dressed as a priest.
Oh, my.
Yeah, I mean, it's all there. This is my own particular angle on this thing. So I started researching more of the churches, and I found out how deeply embedded they were with American intelligence during the Cold War. For a lot of reasons, they were Eastern European churches, right? So there was a venue for moving agents in and out of Eastern Europe as well. And the Soviets did the same thing with Russian Orthodox churches in the United States. They were moving agents into the Russian Orthodox churches, claiming to be priests who really weren't priests.
Right.
They were a KGB agent. So you had this going on all the time, and the whole Kennedy assassination happened in the middle of it. Who introduced Lee Harvey Oswald, to the people who would get him the job at the book depository? But a guy called George Demorenschild, who was thick as thieves with the white Russian community in Dallas. The white Russian community, the Russian Orthodox Church outside Russia, was a very prominent player in all sorts of anti-communist intrigues. So there's a church angle to it. There's more than we could possibly get into in the couple of minutes we have left. So I'll just leave it at that.
Wow. Well, that's a good place to leave it, folks. The trilogy, Sinister Forces, certainly 3 books, and I would recommend all 3 because they do tie together nicely, and they cover a good time period. Of course, we've got the other trilogy, if you will, the Ratline, Unholy Alliance, and the Hitler Legacy, or Hitler, correct, Hitler Legacy, the Hitler Legacy, I'm sorry. Stutter everywhere. All right. But all of Mr. Levenda's books, sir, we do hope you'd come back again and visit with us sometime after your schedule gets a little bit less tight.
A little bit lighter, sure.
All right,
absolutely.
Brother. It was great talking with you. Peter Levenda, our guest. God bless you, my friend. Be safe out there. Thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Thank you very much.